Okay, so welcome to this meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee. The first item on the agenda is apologies. We have apologies from Councillor Helen Dennis, who's still on maternity leave, and Councillor Ellen Kerslake is subbing for her. And we have we have apologies for Councillor Jason Cheery, who is there an echo in here? Who's got work commitments, and Councillor Jack Back is taking his place today. Okay, I think that's all on that item. Item 2 is notification of any items of business which is urgent. I have not been notified of anything.
Chair, there is one left item in relation to the setting up of a joint health overview and scrutiny committee.
Yeah, it's on the agenda. Okay, thank you. Okay, so let's move on to disclosure of interests and dispensations. Councillor Edwards.
For Councillor Mills's direct interviews, I will be leaving the room as per her previous cabinet interview for this committee because we are married.
Congratulations.
I think exactly the same joke was made last time I made that.
And long may it continue. Are there any other interests to declare? No? Thank you very much. I thought by way of introduction, as we're being watched by thousands of people across the borough, we might want to go around the table just to introduce ourselves in terms of who we are and what ward we represent and which parties. So, want to kick us off, Peter?
Thank you, Chair. Peter Babudu, Councillor for Rye Lane Ward, Labour Party.
Leanne Werner, South Bermondsey Ward, representing the Labour Party.
Councillor Gavin Edwards, Labour Councillor, and Nunhead Queen's Road Ward.
Jack Buck, Labour Councillor for Faraday Wood.
Councillor Victoria Olisa, Labour Councillor for Goose Green Ward, which is the old East Dulwich.
Councillor Ian Wingfield, Councillor for St Giles Ward, Labour Party.
Councillor Alice MacDonald, Labour Party Councillor for Newington Ward.
Everton Roberts, Clark for the meeting.
Norman Coombe, Legal Advisor.
Martin Reckler, Co-operative Member, Anglican Diocese of Southwark.
Hamera Ali, Liberal Democrat Councillor for London Bridge and West Bermondsey. Jane Salmon, Liberal Democrat Councillor for Surrey Docks.
Vince Chamberlain, Liberal Democrat Councillor for Borough and Bankside.
Councillor Ellen Kerslake for Newington Ward, and I'm a Labour Councillor.
Thank you all. Okay, so let's move on to item 4, which is the setting up of a joint health overview and scrutiny committee.
Chair, so I'm so sorry to interrupt you. We don't seem to have the minutes of the previous meeting from November to approve. Are they forth?
They're in the sausage machine as we speak. And as you know, I should also report, obviously, that the head of scrutiny, Shelley Burke, left the council's employment at the end of December, and it's very remiss of me. I should have introduced Everton Roberts as her interim replacement and to congratulate Everton on his appointment. Will the minutes be ready for a meeting on Wednesday, Everton? What do you think?
The actual clerk is unwell at the moment, so I'd say definitely for the next meeting.
Okay, so actually that's quite a timely reminder. The next full meeting of the Overview and Scrutiny Committee will be held on Wednesday the 17th of March, so I'd like you all to put that in your diaries if you haven't got that in. So once the minutes have been drawn up, we'll get them circulated anyway. So hopefully that will be done within the next couple of weeks.
Yes. Chair,
yes.
Can I just raise a quick point, if the committee will allow? Before we get into the meat of the scrutiny of the meeting, I just thought I'd put it to the committee, as it is the 75th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz today, and is forming a part of the Holocaust Memorial ceremonies, whether the committee would like to have a minute's silence before we start the formal business.
Yeah.
Yes, that's very timely, thank you. Very remiss of me again. So if we can stand for a minute's silence, please, thank you. Thank you. Right, let's go back to item 4. It's contained on the supplemental agenda 1. So we've already got a copy of the report. Did you want to say anything on this, Everton?
Okay, Chair, I'll be brief. A request has been made by Lambeth Health Overview and Scrutiny Committee to have a joint meeting with Southwark to look at the reconfiguration of proposals relating to Lambeth Hospital. They're proposing to move their mental health services to South London and Mortley, which is in Southwark. There'll be implications for both the patients who are currently in the current service provision and also for Southwark residents also. We're seeking agreement for the establishment of the joint committee and also for 3 representatives from Southwark to be on that committee, 2 Labour, 1 Liberal Democrat. I've received 2 nominations so far, Chair, one of Councillor Victoria Lisa and also Councillor Maria Linforth Hall. I'm not sure if anyone in the room actually is aware of the 3rd representative.
Yeah, we'll come to that when we look at the presentation.
Okay.
Are there any questions on the report before we get into the recommendations? No? Okay. So the first recommendation is that we enter into this joint committee arrangement with Lambeth. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. And second, that the terms of reference are set out in Appendix 1 be adopted. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Thirdly, the membership, 2 Labour and 1 Lib Dem. We've got 1 Labour and 1 Lib Dem nomination. Is that right? Is it Councillor Noakes?
No.
Very right. That's right. Okay. And do you want to propose?
And as the chair of the Health and Adult Social Care Scrutiny Commission, I've suggested Charlie Smith will be the second Labour, because in terms of mental health and advice and support and expertise, I think it fit in really well. And I think that we need to be, even though we're the junior partner in this JOS with Lambeth, I really want to make sure that so that residents and our resources are pulled towards Lambeth. We come out as the weaker partner of this development by moving everything to Maudsley.
Thank you. I was going to raise a question actually. Is there any provision for reserves on this committee?
I'm not sure, Chair. You can put a name forward, and if there's a problem, I'll report that.
Right. Yeah, because I thought it might just be advisable just to have 1 person in reserve. We'd like to nominate.
Just in case if Charlie can't make it, I was going to suggest Darren Merrill. Darren, in terms of his expertise and some of the issues he's brought up in meetings so far, I thought it'd be good to always have a reserve, because we're going to have at least 2-3 meetings in a matter of weeks in February before the public consultation starts at the end of February.
Thank you. Did you want David as a reserve for the Lib Dem? Yeah. Okay, so David Noakes as a reserve, and then you can sort that out at the meeting with the Lambeth. Okay. So the 4th recommendation is that the chair of the Health and Social Care Scrutiny Commission reports back to this body. Do you think you'll be able to do that for us? Thank you very much. Very kind. Okay, so all those recommendations have been agreed. So there's nothing else on that report, so we can move on to item 5, which is the Cabinet consultation with scrutiny on the budget. You'll see on pages 1 and 2, we have the timetable laid out for today. Are there any questions in regard to the timetabling at all? Everybody okay with that? That's good, because we're slightly ahead of time, even better. Okay, so let's move on to item 6 then, policy and resources strategy for 2020 to 21. Now, I just wanted to make sure everybody's got the relevant paperwork. The main report is contained in here, in the main committee document. There's also the 2 papers which details Councillor Ali's and Councillor Mills' portfolio. Has everybody got a copy of those 2? They're just behind on the desk here. If anybody... Okay. Now, the only other thing is that as part of Councillor Williams's interview, we're also supposed to be covering the HRA, and I don't know if anybody's seen a copy of the HRA paper yet.
Chair, copies are being made as we speak and they'll be brought down as soon as possible.
Okay. Obviously, we're having a couple of breaks. When's Kieran on? Okay, so we've got a break. I know it's only 10 minutes, but if you could kindly have a quick read of that if you haven't seen the document before.
It hasn't changed since December, so it's...
Yeah, I know, but just for formality's sake, members need the opportunity to just have a quick whiz through it and see if there's anything that they wish to raise as part of Councillor Williams's interview. Okay, I think that's all the paperwork, isn't it? Everything. Good. Thank you. Right. Okay. So I think then that we can. Are there any more introductions I've got to do, Overton, before I call on Councillor Mills? Right, so Councillor Mills, could you kindly come up and give your 5 minutes?
5 minutes?
At the most.
Okay, so I was going to talk...
Whoa.
Oh, you want us there? Sorry. Okay, I'm used to being here. With sense of name.
One day you may be part of the scrutiny committee.
Part of the scrutiny committee. So, Chair, I have a slot this afternoon to talk through my portfolio details, and it might be that members want to talk through the proposed council tax rise either during that session or in the wrap-up session, or maybe there'll be time before we kick off. But I wanted to use this time to talk people broadly through why we've ended up where we've ended up in terms of the draft budget that you have before you. So I should start by saying it has been perhaps an easier budget to put together this year than in previous years, but I think there's a big difference between easier and easy, and it's worth reminding ourselves that in terms of general grant from government, that has been more than cut in half since 2010. We've lost 63 pence in every pound that we have to spend. And even taking into account the council tax rises of recent years, we've still lost a third of our spending power over the last decade. And even though this year we're seeing something in the region of a 1.6% growth from government in terms of funding, This does nothing, really to take account of even just the kind of pay and inflation pressures we have, let alone the pressures that we've seen growing in recent years as a result of welfare reform, as a result of austerity, the growing pressures because of homelessness and a whole range of other pressures on our services. So I think it would be a mistake to say that this has been an easy budget to set, but perhaps easier. I just wanted to talk you through what you've got in front of you today in terms of the one-year budget. So in July we were facing huge uncertainty as we were looking towards putting the budget together. We didn't know what was happening with the fair funding review of local government finance. We didn't know what system of business rate retention we would be setting a budget based on, and we had no spending review. We did our best. If you followed the budget reports since July that have come to Cabinet, we did our best to predict what we thought our funding gap might be, and we placed that somewhere between 4 million and 32 million. So this was not an easy budget to kind of set because of that huge uncertainty. We knew that inflation and pay pressures would probably be somewhere in the region of £8 million, and we knew that debt financing costs would probably be in around about the region of £3 million. We knew that we could probably have a council tax rise that might net somewhere between £3 and £4 million. So these were kind of the certainties we had to work with. What we asked departments to do was to go away and come back with a one-year cash limited budget. So how could they contain the pressures within their departments? But we also asked them to look over 3 years at a 10% reduction in their budgets. So what you've got today is a little bit of a hybrid of that. Some departments will have seen growth, some departments will have tried to cash limit, but actually some departments might in some areas have gone for slightly larger efficiencies because we looked at something over 3 years and we thought actually we can start to do that. What we saw in September 2019 was only a one-year spending review. So I think there's a very high likelihood that not only do you get a one-year budget this year, but you get a one-year budget next year as well, until we have a longer settlement from government. We saw the fair funding review of local government finance delayed. We saw the social care green paper delayed again, and we saw any changes to business rates delayed again. What you see, you start to move on. From September onwards, we were able to plan with a little bit of greater certainty, and then we got the local government settlement on the 21st of December. As it was a Conservative government that we got on the 21st of December, actually the local government settlement was pretty much what we thought it was going to be. And as I say, effectively, it's about a 1.6% growth, which equates to about £2.4 million. So actually not a great deal when you think about the size of our budget altogether. But there was some additional social care money of £7.3 million, and also business rates have largely been left alone. We get another year with what we've had over recent years. We still, of course, have those pay and inflation pressures of about £11 to £12 million, and also we have a range of commitments. Some of those are things that we've made absolutely clear in the council plan we want to deliver on them, perhaps free swimming lessons or theatre trips. Some of those are slightly unexpected pressures. So, for example, there's a large commitment again to tree management in the budget because we accept that we have to put more money into that service if we are to ensure that the greater number of trees that we have in the borough and the outcomes of the health and safety inspectorate's inspection of the council are to be delivered.
You've got 30 seconds.
Okay. Well, I'll keep going through. And of course, the challenge with the social care money is that we can only spend the social care on social care. It's once again a one-year sticking plaster, but it doesn't allow us to properly plan over the longer term. So to balance the budget, you have around about £6 million of efficiencies, you have around about £2.5 million of additional income, you have savings of around £400,000, and you have commitments. So as I say, they will include pay and inflation, but also some of those other things of around £19 million. And you do have a proposal today to use a council tax rise to balance the budget. So that would be a 2% rise for social care, so only be spent on adult social care, and 1.99% general increase, and that nets us about £4.5 million. I do have a range of other things that I want to go through, but if you want to cut me off there, then
Yep.
so
Well,
be it.
the purpose of today is to ask you questions, and that's what we'll do.
Right.
Can I just point out that the appendices aren't marked up properly, so if I can just let you know exactly where they are. Appendix A is marked up properly on page 29. Appendix B is on page 43. Appendix C is on page 47. Appendix D is on page 49. Appendix F is on page 50. And Appendix F is marked on page 53. It'd be useful when this report goes further if those appendices were clearly marked. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to start the ball rolling if I may. I know Duncan is very good at looking through his crystal ball to the future. We know that the government will be producing its budget in the near future. I just wondered if you had any thoughts on the government's budget and how that might impact on local government at all.
I think, Chair, that the challenge is that we don't know. We are still waiting for certainty about the fair funding review of local government. There's obviously been some noise about that over the weekend. I think any formula that doesn't properly fund deprivation will have an impact on Southwark. But of course we will have some kind of transitional arrangements I think we could expect, and so that will, we need to take the benefit of any transitional arrangements. We also do not know what will happen with business rates, both retention and the reset. But of course for Southwark, we have around £25 million baked into our base budget as a result of growth. So there's a big challenge there, depending on what happens with that. But I don't know, Duncan, whether you think you've got any further clues?
No, but I think the most interesting area, or the two most interesting areas are, first of all, business rate retention. Whether this government considers that retaining business rates is a way of meeting need in local government. I think there's a kind of a lack of correlation, isn't there, between generating business rates locally and providing services. It was fit for purpose 3 or 4 years ago as we were trying to get out of the austerity period. Whether it's still in that place, I don't know. And with the announcement of a fundamental review of business rates anyway, whether business rates is a good basis to assess our need and our funding over future years, I personally question. So I think that would be one interesting area. The other is education. So I think local government has been through a bit of a storm on adult social care and children's social care. Southwark, I think we've weathered those storms pretty well. I think they're still very flimsy and vulnerable as demand pressures and relationships with the NHS and so on and so forth change. But moving forward, schools funding I think is a real issue, and we, as we report in this report, have an £18 million deficit on schools high need block at the end of this year. We're negotiating very hard with DfE to have that deficit refunded. I can't be sure whether we're going to see all or any of that, but if we don't get that money back for additional services provided for educational health care plans, and especially for those between the ages of 19 and 25, we've got a big hole to fill from our underlying general fund budget. So I think the schools approach by government through the budget will be interesting.
And I think with the DSG as well, you have, even if you kind of properly recognise and fund a growth of ECHP plans, actually in terms of your kind of central send team here at the council, has government fairly recognised, if you have 500 children rather than 250 children, actually you need the proper support and administration here centrally. And it's very likely as well that you have greater need of kind of early help and some kind of the social care support. And again, is government recognising that fairly? So I think there's a long way to go on both social care and DSG in terms of having a longer term settlement.
Thank you. Just before I bring other members in, the other question which gets raised, not just within the council but by the general public as well, is obviously we're living through a period of fairly low interest rates at the moment. And so in regard to prudential borrowing, and also we have the municipal bond agency at the moment, and I just wonder, has any thought been given to approaching them at some point?
So I don't think we would want to borrow to keep, you know, frontline services going. We should be borrowing for big substantial investments that, you know, kind of create either kind of life-changing change to our residents or help the transformation of services. So what we try to do with our kind of overall kind of debt management is kind of pay down those loans that have been, you know, let a long time ago at much higher rates, and kind of, you know, take advantage of some of the lower borrowing rates that have been available to us. So I don't think in terms of setting the revenue budget, we would be looking at, you know, vastly kind of changing what you know, borrowing to do that. Certainly in terms of the capital programme, that there are, you know, advantages to be taken, but members will be aware that the Public Works Loan Board rate has been increased, and actually that, you know, that would already be having an impact both on our overall capital programme but also on our new homes programme as well.
Yeah, and can I add, our default position for borrowing remains PWLB. The rates, despite the increase, are still competitive, and they are it is flexible borrowing. The one area of flexibility we don't have is when we want to pay the money back, because we get penalised for that. There is also, I think, some hope that through the budget there will be some repositioning around the PWLB rate increase. It was just illogical and absurd, and whether it's for individual schemes like housing, albeit that that's an HRA cost, not a general fund cost, or for regeneration, I would rather like to see that rate coming back. The municipal bond agency has been going now for 4 or 5 years and still hasn't released a bond, unlike some councils actually who have. So I think we need to see what the product is of their bond, which they say they're due to launch imminently with Lancashire. And if it's looking like a favourable option, we'll have a look at it. But again, it will be a relatively inflexible borrowing tool. We'll see what comes of it.
Okay, that's fine. That's great. Thank you. I've got Councillor Ali and then Councillor Werner.
So following on from the 18 million,
what level of drive in this particular budget have you made for the council to look at alternative forms of income generation or increased amounts of income generation?
So I'm not 100% sure which appendix it is, but they're wrongly labelled anyway. But there is in the region of additional £2.4 million worth of income generation in the budget. Some of those will be kind of increases from previous years in things that already have a charge. Others will be new sources of income.
Yeah, sorry, I think it was beyond just raising charges, so novel, new, different ways, because we've known for years that, you know, things are not headed in the right direction, and at some point we're going to hit a brick wall. If we don't get any of the 18 million back, then our reserves are going to be from DFE. Then we're going to be severely depleted in reserves, and then next year we're going to be in a similar situation, and then we're in real trouble. So it's more sort of about the proactivity of what type of new or different innovative ways have we looked at to generate income to start moving away from that dependency.
So in terms of new and innovative, I think they're probably, off the top of my head I can't think of anything in particular, but there are certainly new proposals in there. So you'll see in the departmental narratives that the work is going on at the moment to increase the private rented sector licensing scheme. That could net in the region of £400,000. It's a very kind of complicated and detailed piece of work. It has to be fairly consulted on, and it also needs Secretary of State approval. So that is starting. But in terms of individual ones, I'm trying to think that, you know, there's probably things that fall into other people's portfolios, but I can't think. Yeah, so you'll know at the moment that we have a large CCG presence here at the council, and that there will be an expansion of that, and I think that nets in the region of another £750,000, but it's not particularly innovative renting out space. I appreciate that.
Okay, Councillor.
Hi. So going back to business rates, so how are you going to be working with the government? How are you going to be feeding into the review on business rates and also ensuring that we get enough money for send? And I just a clarification question. So you talk about we're only borrowing funds for life-changing projects. Can you define what you mean by life-changing projects?
So in terms of borrowing, there's a huge investment, for example, in our new homes programme to make sure that, that we, reduce homelessness, that people have a warm, dry and affordable place to live. But, you think of the other things in our capital programme, whether it's a £20 million school or a £10 million leisure centre, these are the things that I think there is merit in investing in. I think in terms of setting a balanced revenue budget, I don't think it would be prudent to be borrowing money to do that. It's not going to sustain us over the longer term. You had a question on
how you're going to feed into the government review of business rates and also funding for schools. What is the process?
On business, I think there's a real challenge here because actually, our starting point as a council, but also looking at councils generally, is actually government should be fairly funding councils to provide the services that all our residents depend on. And there is an argument that we shouldn't be asking councils to chase business rate growth to fund vital frontline services, and that the government should fairly take into account the challenges that each and every council faces and make sure they're adequately funded to do it. And I think if the government is looking to go back to that, I think there would be merit in us being supporting that. Of course, in terms of business rates growth, we have done well out of that. We have baked a huge part into our base budget. We did exactly what government told us to do, which was to encourage kind of jobs and growth and a vibrant local economy. So I think that if the government is going to continue funding council services with business rates, then we should be arguing that councils should not be punished for encouraging growth in their locality.
Echo all of that. I think in terms of the lobbying, there's the two levels. There's the political layer and there's the officer layer. So specifically through our professional societies, Section 151 officers talk to MHCLG at the moment pretty much every week about business rates and what to do with business rates. And I think nationally there is an anxiety that it's not the right place to be. But from a London point of view, London, the GLA and London councils, I think, are still quite committed to the London Finance Commission work from a few years ago, which was looking for fiscal devolution for London. That's retention of taxes, generation of new taxes, and so on and so forth. And I think we now come to a little bit of a dilemma where when the rest of the country doesn't think that's such a good idea, but London might still like to do it because we generate so much in business rates, there's a real conflict. And we kind of know the north and the counties and the shire districts are more likely to be looked on favourably during the next 5 years. So that's a reality that we all have to face. I think there's the dilemma really is for London councils and how to balance that argument. From a personal point of view, I don't think fiscal devolution is actually the same as devolution of powers to do new things and maybe create new innovative income generating schemes. Tourist tax, for example, is one that keeps coming back, and under fiscal devolution and devolution of powers, that's the kind of thing that would liberate some London activity, I think, and I think works equally across the rest of the country too. But the two layers really, London councils and Section 151s.
Okay.
And just on send, I think the first challenge for us is getting our DSG back on budget. So government has given some additional money for send. So we're probably nearer to being £2 or £3 million a year off where we need to be. So the lobbying needs to continue. We need to make the case why we need additional money. So I think our first challenge is getting back on budget, and then after that it's the argument about how do we pay down the deficit that has been created because government has underfunded us. So there's clearly an acknowledgement of underfunding because they have added more resources for the coming year. So I think it's really important that we hold firm and we say it is the government's responsibility to sort out the deficits that we have accrued, but also councils nationwide have accrued.
Okay, I've got 5 councillors who indicated to speak. The first is Councillor Chamberlain.
I wanted to ask about the Brexit preparedness. So the report does mention that Brexit presents a real risk, a real uncertainty. Last year we had a one-off initiative of £2 million for the Brexit risk reserve, wasn't it? So I'm interested in what did that show us in terms of where we're exposed potentially as a council in the future budgets, and that I think came from a government initiative, did it? No, did the government not provide some funding for local authorities to help prepare? Okay, so I mean, so presumably that's not been offered this time either. I think the question I'm asking is, what did that initiative that we embarked on last year produce? What did it lead to? How are we now in a better place than we were as a result of that? And how can you give us an assurance that, or what assurance can you give us that we're not prepared for any fallout from Brexit? Because I appreciate there's only £50,000 allocated this year.
So, I mean, I'm happy to do this now, or we can do it in more detail in my portfolio session, but the Brexit risk reserve was money we set aside last year. It was what we did, it was not government money, so that's £2 million. That £2 million has not been spent, but then we haven't had Brexit yet, have we? So I think at the moment, maybe I'm speaking rather too hopefully. We have kind of 10 months for the government to negotiate a sensible exit from the EU that leaves us closely aligned economically with the EU. And best case scenario, that's where we end up on the January 1st next year. And places like London can ride out any potential economic dip relatively easily, and it might be that very little of that risk reserve is needed. But of course, worst case scenario is that we still end up with no deal on the 31st of December this year, and we crash out of the EU, and that £2 million will hopefully ease the potential economic impact that might have on the council, perhaps in lost business rates, perhaps in having to put more money into kind of local job support. I don't know. I think it's very difficult to know. It might be that we lose suppliers as a result of a hard kind of crash out of Brexit, and we have to step in and intervene. So that £2 million remains there as that risk reserve. We also allocated £300,000 worth of kind of money, which we will begin to spend in the coming months as we do an uplift in our communications with EU residents to make sure that they get settled status, that we do additional work with those vulnerable groups as we head towards 31st of December. We work with the voluntary sector to help those people whose settled status has perhaps been turned down and they need to go through it again. And there'll be a range of kind of communications, roadshows and additional work in the coming 10 months. And that 300,000 will go some way to supporting that.
Okay, thanks. Sorry, no, we got other people. Councillor MacDonald.
Yeah, so I don't know if it is for you, it might be Councillor Lurie as well, but I just wondered if you could say something on the equalities analysis of the budget overall. There's quite a lot of outstanding things still to be completed. And then we discussed last year about how the budget could also be looked in terms of its sustainability impacts. And with the council declaring a climate crisis, I just wondered, I know that's probably not in here, but in terms of how that factored into some of the assessment of the proposals and how that might come forward in future years.
I suppose, it's a good challenge about sustainability, and perhaps we ought to be mainstreaming that into the report in the way that we do the equalities analysis. I think it's a good challenge, and we haven't done it this year. I think we've very much thought about what more we can be doing in terms of responding to our commitment on the climate emergency, and there is a £2 million commitment this year to help us begin the kind of big piece of work we need to do so that we're properly prepared to meet our commitments by 2030. Our expectation is that next year, so for the 21-22 budget, we will have to mainstream an ongoing revenue commitment. But I think we think as well that actually a lot of our response to the climate emergency might be capital commitment rather than revenue commitment. On the equalities analysis, I mean, I suppose, you know, each and every challenge that we face in the budget, it is always the utmost in our minds about the impact on vulnerable residents and whether what we're doing serves to protect them. And I think as a cabinet, we would always veer towards trying to make efficiencies that don't have impact, that look at, you know, things like income generation. We've looked at council tax this year rather than trying to take more money out of the budget. And I think with the council tax, I didn't have a chance to run through it. Of course, we have left our council tax reduction scheme unchanged. We probably have one of the most generous council tax reduction schemes in the country, if not in London now. And that means that any working age recipient of council tax scheme will only see a rise of a maximum of 13 pence a week.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Buck.
My question has been asked. Thanks.
Excellent. Councillor Babudu.
Thank you, Chair. Hats off to you and the various cabinet member leads for identifying relevant efficiencies across the board. But just at a kind of top level, I wanted to ask how how have we gone about anticipating the possible impact of those on delivery, given the extent of efficiencies that have kind of happened to date, or is there a kind of forward-facing way we're going to make sure that the efficiencies aren't actually having a delivery impact?
I mean, basically, I think what you're saying is there a sort of longer-term effect on some of the efficiencies that are being proposed, which might be immediately obvious in the report?
So, you know, the start of this process was 3-year planning. So we looked at a cash limited budget, but we looked over a 3-year period as well. So actually, you know, a lot of the efficiencies are probably part of a 3-year plan. We tried to capture some of that in the departmental narrative, but we took a decision that we couldn't set a clear 3-year budget because of the uncertainty we face and that we only have a 1-year settlement. So a lot of the efficiencies planning will see change over 3 years, but you're only capturing the first year of it in what you have before you. And I think that does tend to be because we accept that you know, if you are going to say, you know, try and change something which generates, you know, £300,000 worth of efficiencies, you are unlikely to be able to do that in a 1-year period. So there'll be a gradual kind of route map towards it, but it's not captured in the. I appreciate it's not captured in the paperwork here. I don't know whether there's any more than.
It's the annual conundrum, isn't it? Saving your efficiency, and one person's efficiency is another person's saving, isn't it? The one thing I would say in this budget is the people run our business, actually, and that's whether they're our employees or whether they're in contracts. And there is no discernible reduction in our headcount in this budget. They're quite the opposite. When you look at the 7.3 million of social care grant that's coming into the system and is bypassing its way straight through to social care, the adult social care precept and 2% inheritance way straight through to social care, there is actually some element of growth. So I guess by way of people capacity, this seems to me like quite a low risk budget, but to make an efficiency you have to make a change, and that carries a risk, I'm afraid, and sometimes it doesn't work.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Lisa.
Thank you, Councillor Vicky Mills. If I go to, I think, section 85 on page 24, I just wanted to ask you if you could explain.
Just wait,
Sorry.
that page in front of me. Sorry.
So, yeah, you've got the list of the commitments for children's adult services, which I'm really I'm concerned about. Just go down to the bottom item in the list of commitments, transformation 1.282. Could you clarify what that means? Because is it transformation in terms of how we're going to deliver children and adult services with our different partners, CCG, or is it something completely different?
Fundamentally, the 1.2 million is putting money aside into a transformation fund. So the transformation is not designed yet. It's to actually enable transformation to take place once it's been worked through.
Can I just clarify, is that transformation of how we're actually going to deliver those two services, or transform in terms of?
That's probably a better question for David and Jasmine, but both I think is the answer.
Okay, thank you. I just want to make a couple of general points, if I may. The tables, I think, would benefit from a certain historical analysis. I'm a person who believes in graphs and tables, and it's important to show trends. And I think you recall at the Council Assembly last year, the 27th of February, I raised the point about historic data from 2010, and I think you gave a commitment to produce that within the budget report. And although the current figures are here, there's no historic figures. And I think it would be more meaningful both to members and to the wider public if that historic information was actually contained in the report, because as it stands at the moment, it's only really a snapshot of here and now. I think we would all benefit from that sort of historic analysis. And while I'm on that point, I'd also like to say, I think it would also be useful if we could delineate between money that we can actually administer, if I can put it that way, and money which is passported, because obviously we can't change that, what's passported, and that sort of distorts our budget overall, to be perfectly frank. I think members here are more concerned about what we can influence, what we can control in terms of spending and commitments, and what we can't. So I think having some sort of delineation between that, so that we know exactly what our real budget is, what we can really influence and control, would be extremely useful. And taking up Councillor Ali's earlier point, I think that we are running deficit budgets, and at some point, given the Rumsfeld unknown unknowns which are there in the future, I think we have to be very prudent in our financial planning, and it's a steady as she goes budget, I can see that very clearly, but we also need to have an eye to the future, and I don't see that reflected in this report too much.
Okay, well, certainly on the trends and the passported budget, we can make amendments and do that. We do try to be as transparent as possible with the budget report. So we've been the reports have been in the public domain since July, and we publish a very comprehensive draft budget in early December, which many councils don't. And and of course on the back of that, we would always seek to improve the information available between the first week in December and this last week in January, and we would welcome your kind of suggestions and input from that time onwards. But we will certainly take those two things away and look at. In terms of running a deficit budget, I think that's absolutely right. It's what we don't want to do. But I think we have not yet lost the argument on DSG, and I think considering that these are some of our most vulnerable young people, we should continue to be fighting for them. And when it becomes clear that we have lost the argument, then of course we cannot set a deficit budget. But I think at this stage that argument is far from lost, and I think we would be giving ground to the DfE and the Treasury unnecessarily if we chose to pay down that deficit on the DSG right now. So I think that fight continues, but it might be a different situation when we bring this back next year.
No, it's just my concern is obviously we're entering into other commitments, financial commitments, and you've already indicated the loss of funding that we've had from the central government, and presumably that's going to continue. And the report in September, I mean, Duncan's forecast there for 2021-2 was a deficit of 21 million, and then 22 to 23 up to 33 million. I know those figures are probably altered to a certain extent, but you know, the trend, as I was saying before, is still that we'll be in greater deficit than we are at the moment.
I take those points absolutely. I just really got to say we are in a very fortunate position actually. The settlement actually ran very much in our favour and absolutely at the top end of expectations. The budget on the 11th, 20th of March is going to be fundamental, and then we move into spending review. I think Ian, your points around budget which is actually accessible is a really important one. It probably hasn't come up sufficiently this morning. The more and more of our budget that becomes ring-fenced, the less flexibility, for example, we have for efficiency. Because the organisation working together is more likely to give those non-damaging efficiency opportunities than when you're having to work in the silos into which we're almost being pushed at the moment. So, but we can certainly do some work on the report to put some more detail on history and that context.
Excellent. And one other point just on that, looking at the various departmental narratives, there seems to be variation between the reporting between different departments, and I think if we could have a sort of standard format, for instance, just comparing the first two, the chief executive and the children's and adults. The chief executive's budget, I know, there's no income there, but obviously there is a net budget, and there's clear expenditure given as well as commitments. Looking at the children's and adults, you can't really delineate that from the narrative here, and I think what we need is really a clear for each department what the net budget is, what the savings proposed are, what the commitments proposed are, and what any income is for each of these departments laid out in this narrative, because it isn't clear, and I think that would benefit not just members but the wider public as well. Just one other point while I've got the microphone. Just on the council tax collection, again, to aid transparency, I mean, our collection rate is very good, I understand that, but it would be useful to have a table comparing it with other local authorities' collection rates in London, just to see where we are in terms of whether we're at the top, in the middle, or towards the end, because it is a substantial sum that's not collected. It's about £3 million roughly. And over time, that can accumulate an impact on our potential budget.
Very happy to take the suggestion away on the trend. I think that's probably captured in the council performance reports, but very happy to put it in there. I would say it is very clear that we've done a huge amount of work over the last 10 years to improve collection rates, but it is clear that it has now plateaued, and it has plateaued for 2 or 3 years. And I don't think that's because of something that we are not doing. I think it's a reflection of the impact of universal credit and other welfare changes. And actually, if anything, sustaining the current collection rate takes a huge amount of work on Dom and his teams. It's one of their top priorities. So certainly we can look again, but we took the decision this year when we were setting the council tax base not to propose an increased collection rate.
No, I understand that, but it'd be nice to see where we sit within the rest of London, to see whether we've maintained opposition or not. And there may be other things other local authorities are doing that were not, in order to increase the take-up. Are there any other questions for this general part before we move on? No? Well, thank you very much. Now, if we go back to our timetable, we're 10 minutes behind time. Now we've got the person we've all been waiting for, Councillor Ali, to come up and present her budget. And as I said to Councillor Mills, if you could keep your opening comments to around 5 minutes, that would be greatly appreciated.
Hi everyone, good to see you all. Okay, let me know when to start. Do you want me to start now? No. Okay. You talked about the net figures. For children's schools and adult social care, I'd like to start with the net figures. The top budget lines are adults 93.8 million, including commissioning, children 60.3 million, education 8.5 million, minus of course the dedicated schools grant, which I'll come on to later. Now, children and adult services budgets make up 2/3 of the overall council budget, as you know, and this will be the 3rd year that we've managed to balance this budget, and you know, it's worth taking a note on that, because you'll remember it's been very difficult for local authorities, and since that whole terrible austerity journey started, you know, we are now in a position that we can say that we are balancing our budgets, and that is mainly down to the brilliant work of the staff team that we have here, the directors that are here, David at my side, we've got Nina and Alistair sat behind me, and of course the work that you do on Scrutiny, and of course the fantastic finance team. All that brilliant work done from here, the town hall, to the front line, great work means that we are balancing these budgets. And of course, as a matter of the additional 7.3 million of one-off grant funding, that too is helping us balance these budgets. Okay, adult care, 93.8 million, with a commitment to save 3.1 million. Efficiencies and improved use of resources. We've got the workforce development, which has already been developed. Mental health into the new wonderful building, Castle Mead. The older people's hub, that vision is coming to life, that will develop savings. We've also got the all-age disability work. Okay, in the interest of time, I'll go on to children's social care. There are no efficiencies. I repeat, no efficiencies. And we are in a really good position, because hardly any London authorities can say the same thing. You know, so that is, you know, brilliant work. And this is a strong story, very strong story. And who else can do this and maintain minimum wage? Okay. How much time have I got now?
3 minutes.
Okay, brilliant. Education then. The school's budget must be understood. Well, we're not here to discuss that, but I did have a lot of questions on that. But the council's education budget, 80 million, dedicated schools billion, 320 million. So basically, that's money that comes in and goes out, and even when it doesn't come in, it still goes out. Okay, the savings. You will see that we've got Aylesbury Nursery under savings, and we can take questions under that. I was there on Friday with Nina and spoke to all of the parents about these savings, and I'll talk to you about that in the questions and answers. The DSG, we have got 12 million from the DFE, 5 million for high needs block, 7 million for schools block. We're looking at an 18 million deficit, but as Councillor Mills said before me, we have not shut the door on that, and we have had the DFE on the 21st in the town hall. Okay, going forward, on the issue of the 3-year budget, we are dependent on central government funding decisions for education and social care. I can talk to you a bit about the questions on that, but I think in the interest of time, I would like to take you to page 50 of your papers. And I was just going to end on, if I may, our commitments. So, children's services then, you can see basically we are looking at piloting a Sure Start approach aimed at teenagers and parents. You and all the community tell us they are worried about what is happening to our young people on our streets, and this will really help. You know, it was a good idea, I think it was Councillor Mills' idea, and we are going to take that forward. The next, you will know about our commitment to support 100% of children and young people with mental health needs. We will be investing further in that, as you can see in front of you. And I'll be reporting an update at the beginning of the Council Assembly on where we are on that. Now then, in terms of the rest of the commitments, you can see drug and alcohol. We're looking at a pause approach with that, an investment in prevention and public health approach. It's a bit tricky with these budgets because we have that money, but you can't share it all around the council. You have to make sure that you spend this money on children and adults, and that's exactly what we're doing. But as you can see, by opening it up to prevention, we're able to spend that money innovatively. Okay, I think...
30 seconds.
Okay, I think I will leave it there. I've covered everything I wanted to, but in questions you may want to ask about DSG and basically what we think about a 3-year budget. But I just wanted to end on the one point. I think, Chair, when I heard you talk about having a look at these figures in retrospect, I couldn't agree with you more, but you will see no more when you look at the 2010 and the retrospective to where we are now. You will feel the journey that our department has been on. And I'm happy to say it started badly with austerity, but it's a good news story now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's very kind of you to say all that. I've got 3 members that have indicated, but before they do, I just want to, 4 members. I just wanted to ask a quick question, if I may. Looking at your savings overall, they're roughly about 3.5 million, and then in terms of the commitments, it's nearly 12 million pounds. So that would be an increase of about 6% on the budget. So I'm just wondering if you could just say a little bit more about how you square the piece on that one.
I think that, in terms of the commitments, that is what the savings that we have made, and we've looked at the care packages on adults. I mean, the government gave us new money, and they said, you can have this new money. My counterparts in other London authorities, they are sharing it between adults and children. We are in a better position to take that money and look innovatively. So we're not just fighting fire here. Because of the work that we've done already in order to save money and efficiencies done by the department, we are able to look at that in a more innovative way. I mean, for example, on the savings, if I may, you will see that efficiencies around care packages, around adult services, so you will see other efficiencies, but actually we've had 7.3 million new money in addition, which savings combined new money has enabled us to look more innovatively, and that's why we've got that percentage on the budget.
Okay, so you say that the commitments are fully funded then?
They are.
Yeah, and in fact, Chair, it's ring fence for social care. This is one of the, we cannot spend that 7.3 million on anything other than social care.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it comes back to the point I was making earlier about what's ring fence, what's passported, blah, blah, blah. We need that delineation so that we know exactly what we can control.
Right, so...
Councillor Lisa, first of all. Now.
Thank you, Cabinet Member Ali. I think I'll go back to repeat my question I repeated to Cabinet Member Mills about transformation fund 1.282, which is saying it's a commitment for children and adult services. Could you give me more detail on what that transformation is? Is it how you deliver the service, or is it how you work with individual partners, whatever? Because I've got to do about transformation. I just want more clarity on that. Page 24, table point 85.
Okay, thank you. Which page is it, sorry?
It's page 24, table 85, says the list of commitments in children and adult services up to 7.332 million. It's the last item in the table.
Okay. Right, my understanding of that, it's around the commissioning, workforce development, enabling social workers to work more efficiently, work smartly, in better buildings, more efficient, and have digital care records. So that is my understanding of that. I can pass over if you wanted to add anything.
To answer the question directly, it is essentially focused on working with our partners around transformation of services. So a good example I could give is in the older people's new service, the Older People's Hub. It won't be called an Older People's Hub, but as a model. We're bringing the voluntary sector together as a front door, and working with them so that they'll have time to listen to what's concerning that older person or their family, and then to make sure that the £25 million, circa £25 million each year that this council puts into the voluntary sector is targeted at those who most need it. But that requires changes like colleagues in the voluntary sector being trained as trusted assessors. So when they meet David and say, I think David may have some memory issues and may need some follow-up, then that's trusted, and then action follows from that, rather than people wasting and losing precious time in waiting for referrals to be assessed. There's a huge capacity and resource in the voluntary sector and with the NHS and with our social care workforce. So by investing in partners and investing in frontline staff, we believe we can get a much better service and better outcomes for people. So it's essentially the second part of your question that you asked, is this about investing in transformation system and services and partners? That's essentially what we have in mind for that.
Thank you. I've got 5 councillors wanting to ask questions. The first is Councillor Buck.
Okay, I'll try and be brief. So my question specifically was about our child mental health commitments. I was in Story Square Primary School with some community groups in Faraday last week, and one of the things that became abundantly clear there from a project they were running is that a particular area that we are struggling to reach if we want to have 100% mental health, child mental health commitments, is children who have no recourse to public funds. Could you tell us if within our current plans, extending child mental health provision extends to those with no recourse to public funds, and how that's going to be delivered? Because at the moment it's a bit of a black spot, I think.
Yes, I'm going to report some good news. We're about to open a facility, and it will be a drop-in facility on Rye Lane, the ward that I'm in. More accident than design, but basically because it's a good location. And no one with, when people turn up with no recourse to public funds, they won't be denied a service. They'll get wraparound, we'll get wraparound services and signpost people, whoever they are really. It's not going to discriminate.
Yeah, just on that, because I do think, I mean, that's fantastic news, and I'm really glad to hear that that is opening. As you can understand, Southwark is a very large borough, and children who have no recourse to public funds are not placed specifically in location to facilities, and say if you were one of these families living in Dulwich Wood or in Surrey Docks, that's quite a long way to go. And as you know, the financial support that those families receive is next to nothing on a weekly basis. So is there some kind of options that we're looking at in terms of supplying financial support, if that is kind of the bespoke option for children on no recourse to public funds? Because say, for example, kids who even live in Faraday, they might be able to walk to Peckham, but they can't afford to take the bus. So have we put any thought to that? Just because I think if we're being serious about 100% child mental health needs, we need to make sure those services are accessible for people who are at the sharpest end of the financial challenge.
I couldn't agree more, and that is exactly why we didn't just do this in of its own, idea. We basically, while I was looking at this, we managed to get the Cabinet to agree 2 million to invest in schools. So there's some brilliant work going on in schools around prevention, and so that I'm hoping that will help at that end, really. I mean, basically, as it does now, so if there's a child in need, you don't have a discussion about money at the school. They just direct the child to where the need is. So I'm hoping that will pick it up. I mean, I feel that I take your point about the bus routes and everything, accessibility, but it felt like out of all the buildings we could have used, that felt about the most accessibility, because you've also got, a quick bus route to King's, and you've got, obviously there's a SLAM service, so, it felt that was the right point. But what you've said, I will absolutely plough into the discussions around the mental health prevention in schools, so thank you very much for that.
So there was 2 million last year, there is an additional £1.5 million this year. I think the clear message to schools is that in terms of the activities they undertake, we would not, we would be hoping that they were offering preventative services to every pupil in their school and family members with them. But I think the challenge is when a child reaches a stage where they need NHS support support with the mental health crisis, and is the NHS effectively stepping in for those children who might have no recourse to public funds? So that's the right challenge that we should be making as well.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Ali.
So you've put under your list this 1.282 million towards innovative or whatever new projects.
Yeah.
But have you actually, out of that, what's unclear or it's not very transparent to me, how many of those are actually must-have projects versus flights of fancy? So have you done a must-have analysis, or do you have a full list of those projects?
Well, clearly we don't waste precious public money on flights of fancy. The basis for using transformation funding is that proposals are worked with our partners. We have the overall council plan and we operate within that, but the sign-off on transformation funding actually rests with myself and the strategic director for finance and governance. So this money isn't sitting in a political space of I'd like to do this or like to do that. We operate within the council plan, but we have to be assured, both Duncan and I have to be assured, that the requests that are coming forward for transformation are consistent with the work of the council and our partners, and that it's exploiting the opportunity to go further, faster with partners. So, for example, most of that funding will be spent with the voluntary sector to upskill and train their staff. It will be spent in partnership with the NHS to look at gaps that people tell us they're falling down between, to prevent people having greater need later on. And unless and until there's a very clear cost benefit to the council, we wouldn't be pushing ahead with those projects. So we have several projects in discussion with partners. I accept the point that it's not detailed and clear. I think that's absolutely fair. But we take a very rigorous approach to sign off on that funding with political blessing. But Duncan and I personally have to sign off on all of those spends.
For clarity, I wasn't saying that people were not following a process in any rigorous way, but then just to get an answer to my question, what proportion of that is what you would classify as we must do this, otherwise we're going to start to go backwards?
Yeah, I mean, look, the flights of fancy, I mean, I'm glad that struck off really, because actually I gave quite an upbeat presentation, but that is on the back of really, really hard work. I mean, basically, the teams in this department, have had to work really, really hard on budget recovery, and that is, I've done it myself when I've been an officer, and it is, flights of fancy is not in it. You have to laboriously say line by line what all your expenditure is, and we are going through, look, we're still going through that on the education. Sat behind me is our Director of Education, and that she has to, every week, she has to sit down with officers and basically justify every piece of expenditure. So I can absolutely assure you, having been on this journey, part of this journey with this team, there's no flights of fancy. And all of these ideas that we have and we talk about, we have had to fight and argue about how it would improve life, life in the community really. So, Councillor Ali, I would, from one alley to another, I would ask you to strike that flights of fancy, because that is not the space we're in.
So I just want an answer to my question about what proportion is mandatory.
Can I suggest, I think where you're trying to get to is probably better described as what is required by statute and what isn't required by statute, and how much discretion do we have in either of those areas.
So all the work that we undertake will be required by statute, and it's the model of how we're responding to that. I think a helpful way to explain this is that in the room next door, the directors of children's services from all the London boroughs are meeting right now with the president of ADCS. 27 of my colleagues from across London are overspent to the tune of several £million. So they would be taking this 1.2 million and just offsetting that against an overspend. We're in a position where, because we have managed our budget and we are not overspent, we can innovate in the kit and the approaches that our social workers use and what our voluntary sector partners use, because I think it's fair to say that there is untapped potential in the voluntary sector, and they're really, really keen to work with us. They bring so much heart and effort to this that unless we invest in their training and give them the kit and the premises to work in, they're not able to work to their full potential and to really realise our social capital. So the reason why I can say it's all necessary and statutory is because the work will be around people needing help and fulfilling that little reference part of the legislation from the Care Act, which is our duty to prevent people needing services later on. So most people just draw the line here and say, there's the drawbridge, can you reach it? You know, there's the threshold. But actually the legislation does include a duty to prevent where we can. And so this allows us with integrity to do that. And for children and families, you know, we as a council will either be spending, meeting statutory need by overspend, or by investing in these areas. But the What Work Centre that has been set up by government, work of the Association Directed Children's Services, we have greater reference points now than we've perhaps ever had, or certainly we're missing for some years, to help guide us to make sure that what we're doing is relevant and in the space of statutory responsibilities rather than enhancements or add-ons by choice or preference.
Chair, I don't know if I can quickly add. I mean, we're in a situation where, you know, the government has entirely failed for the long-term planning for social care, either children's or adults. And, you know, nearly a quarter of our budget in that area will be one-year grants. So, you know, we have to do our best to absolutely protect the statutory part of our services, making sure that they are robust and they continue to do the job they do. And where we have some additional money, you know, what can we do in terms of prevention, that if it's a one-year investment, it might allow some transformation of services, we might recoup some of that money. But ideally, it will be more than a one-year investment. But the total failure of the government to set out its long-term vision and funding for social care leaves us in this very uncertain position. So I don't think they're flights of fancy. I think they're absolutely investments that hopefully we will continue to make over the longer term. But if they're not, they will be good short-term interventions that will have a very strong preventative agenda.
I have the answer to my question, which is prevention is better than cure. And I would encourage members to not hang on to an end of a sentence, because the start of the sentence was the must-haves. And so, David, thank you very much for the answer.
Okay. I've got Eleanor now, please.
Just a suggestion. I think the kind of spirit of Victoria and Humera's kind of questions were particularly on the transformation, that they'd like a bit more kind of granularity, so that kind of comes alive for people we serve. So maybe when perhaps we just need to put this on a shelf, but like when we come to our recommendations, come back to it, and that might be the sort of thing we could ask for. And just as an example, what I think this is, but it would be really helpful is, you know, I can completely see how if we're working with a partner who's providing care work for elderly people, them having better mental health training, them having access to some of the same data, I can see, but I think it's kind of making that figure come alive in those kind of examples is what would be helpful.
Okay. Can I just come back on? Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm in the process of now, outside of this forum, is putting an annual report together about some of the things that we have as a department that we have achieved. So I think that should bring it to life. And also, it's got links to all the cabinet reports. Like at the next cabinet, for example, we'll be given a contract. I'm not going to mention who that is now, but come to cabinet. But that will be like the mothership of the older people's services, who will work along with all the other voluntary sector bodies. So what I'll do is I'll actually get that report to you by the close of next week now. So that will bring some of it alive. But yes, you know, do put that in the recommendations. Thank you.
Okay. Got Jane next, please.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to ask about the care packages and the review of them. Are the actual service users and their families going to be in this review? And what do you envisage? I worry, being a lady of the older generation, care packages, I know they work through the whole generation, but having experienced care packages for family members, I worry very much when someone says, oh, we can find savings, we can, and you just think, what would people go without? It worries. It worries. Now, I'm sure that's not going to happen, but I'd just like some reassurance that it hasn't, and who's going to be involved in the review.
Thank you very much for that. The review's already taken place, and that was basically what had actually netted us. The work with care packages is part of the work that got us to the balanced budget. Now, you know, it's a good question, but I can absolutely assure you that the basis of the, you know, the reablement work, for example, is about actually, you know, having a super team that actually works with people and looks at their needs. I think I mentioned this last time I came, that I shadow, because I myself was very worried about that, because I'm from a social care background myself. So I just thought, oh, there's care packages, why are you touching that? But when I went and I visited the team, I've been there several times now, and the work is second to none. You meet the team, they don't look like your typical social workers. And I mean, basically, they say, don't they, the test is, you know, the my mum test, whereas I'm that age now, it's my self-test. Is it going to be good enough for me in my older? Yeah, exactly. So anyway, I can absolutely say that the people that do the reablement work, I've got this lovely case study. I went along and shadowed someone, and I looked at this person and I thought, oh, you know, they didn't feel like your typical social worker. But when we got to the house of this woman who had, my favourite case study, this woman who had basically, you know, she had multiple needs, and she was on a sofa, and he asked if I could come in and shadow, and she was fine. And there was a nurse there, and there were all these professionals around this woman who was like basically watching the telly while she was having professionals around, which was a bit weird. But then this guy, all the professionals went, the other professionals, we turned the telly off, and he basically had a lovely manner, and he spoke to her about what her goals were. You know, she'd been living the life of sofa life since coming out of the hospital, and she was basically saying that her goals were at first going to the garden path, and now her goals were going to get her own shopping. So it's actually enabling people to live independently, and that is, it's always difficult. When you're in times of, you know, reducing costs, there will be these big philosophies, and there will be fashion in social care. But, you know, I mean, as someone that comes from social care, I'm not going to buy a pig in a poke, and you can absolutely take it from me that this is working. It seems to be working. It's helping people work towards independence. You know, I actually said at another scrutiny session, because I go to a lot, you know, you're quite welcome to come with me and shadow as long as people. So come along and see it for yourself. But actually, when you look at the enormity of these budgets cannot be underestimated. And when you look at that, when you look at, oh, you know, we're at the end of this now. So when you look at this care packages, it's about 80 million on care packages, but it's less than 2% saving. So it's all relative. But I made that point last because it's not all about the money. It's about quality of care and helping people to work towards independence.
And this is the third year of this particular saving. So it's effectively the final cohort.
Yes.
So these are things that have been going on for a number of years. And actually have been really successfully done. I think if there was a problem, it would have emerged by now.
Okay, thank you. We'll recommend that Councillor Salmon as your permanent shadow scrutiny everywhere you go. Okay, I've got two more councillors. I've got Councillor Babudu next, please.
My question's been asked, yeah.
Fantastic. And Councillor Werner.
Hi, thank you. I was just going to ask you about PSHE education, so it's going to be compulsory from 2020. Could you tell me what resources you're putting into that? Thanks.
So the PSHE work, that's work that we do in schools in any case through our PSHE networks. We're building on that through the mental health work that we're doing, so we're combining the two and making that very closely together. So there are some new aspects to the curriculum that's coming in September 2020. So we're working with our schools in terms of the guidance that we've got from TFB and how they might implement that and to integrate disability any early signs of that. And that will be primary and secondary.
Okay, seems we've got more councillors now that want to ask questions. So Councillor Kerslake, then MacDonald.
Thank you, Chair. So just a really quick point. I think the figures that you quoted at the beginning of the breakdown of your budget, I don't think they're in the report, and I think it'd be helpful if they were in your introduction as well. So yeah, just a comment. The second one was, so the kind of the headline figures you've got for the sort of Sure Start approach for teenagers and for commitment to young people's mental health. And I've said this to you many times, Jasmine. I think that's great. I think it's the biggest challenge facing all of us. What's happening to young people and how that's kind of manifesting itself on our streets. But rather than just kind of stand up and kind of say those figures as a local politician, I'd like to know kind of how you got to them. So how do we know that that's the right amount? What's it going to be? What's it going to go on? How did you build that figure up? Was it just kind of the most you could get, or was this sort of, what was the process to getting there? And I think you also wanted to say something on the DSG and 3-year budgeting.
Can I just, my questions relates to Eleanor's actually. It's as well as the numbers. It's from the pilot. How many children do you expect to reach through the Sure Start, just in terms of impact and where it's going to be? Would be really useful.
Okay. On the first point I wanted to make about the net figures, it's interesting that I must have preempted your question about net figures, because that is how I work really. And when I put those figures for the presentation, obviously it raised a lot of eyebrows, but you know, I'm sure we can put that into the report. But you know, when you're managing budgets, you need to know exactly what you're dealing with. So I'm happy to circulate those figures. They are the net, basically. So, on the issue of the Sure Start and the mental health, it's all prevention, but you know, I want to assure you that you'll remember in 2018 that I actually announced that we could do better for our children than the NHS target of 35%, and a part of that work, which I'll talk to at Council Assembly, but a part of that work was actually being in a, you know, going out, seeing how everybody did things. You know, we've been all around the country looking at good examples, getting good experience, but actually we could say that it is a bit more than, you know, licking your finger and putting it up in the air. It is based on intelligence that we have gathered around the country, and intelligence that we have gathered from working with our own partners and our own schools on the ground. So we've got huge partnerships, and we hope that that's a figure which will enable us to, you know, develop something, and then when it's developed, keep it going really until we win the fight, which Councillor Mills has already mentioned, with government to have, you know, real funding for some of these areas rather than what we've got at the moment, which is like lots of different pots that you get from here, there and everywhere. But we want, you know, a green paper on how you do the funding. So really, to answer your question, it is based on as scientific as we possibly can within the current context where you just get pots of funding dropped on you or not, basically. On the pilot question, I'll hand over because that's a bit more technical, but I can assure you that we've got you know, some brilliant people and you know, that manage the front line, looking at how we can look at that, how we can develop a pilot from which we can learn from very, very quickly. So do you want to say anything about that? Thank you.
Just 2 points, if I may. Firstly, going back to the CAMS work, we had a very, very extensive joint review with NHS colleagues, which reports to the Health and Wellbeing Board, and the commitment and the approach was agreed. So that's cross-party. Councillor Notes as a member of the Health and Wellbeing Board, as well as key cabinet members being on that and NHS partners. So there's a much more detailed analysis and plan that has been challenged, debated, agreed in that space rather than scrutiny per se. But just to make you aware, that's certainly available if you were interested to look deeper and further into that. In relation to the Sure Start approach, we would be the first in London to do a Sure Start for teenagers and families. We're one of the very, very few London boroughs that still has children's centres available, 16 children's centres available. Most boroughs have either closed them all or closed most of them and moved to a tiny, tiny proportion. But we, as a council, we've protected, you as an administration protected, all of our 16 children's centres, and we know the impact that has on children and families. So this idea is one of taking that approach with teenagers and parents. In terms of forecasting how many folk we think we'll be able to work with, in my mind and in colleagues' minds who've been discussing this with our cabinet member and Councillor Mills, who was previous cabinet member, who was challenging us then about this, and where the idea comes from. It's very much akin to our YOS service, our youth offending service, which works with about 500 young people at any one time and their families. So I think at full strength, and it will take us a while to get there, but I think at full strength it will be working with a similar kind of cohort, because we'd want to be working with brothers and sisters and with parents. But it's fair to say it's new, no one else has done it. We believe it will make a significant difference just in holding teenagers at a time of confusion and complexity, and holding their parents, who are also teenage parents by that time. So I have in mind that in terms of the model, it will be akin to us, about 500 young people or 500 families.
Okay. Right, thank you very much. I think we've exhausted that section.
One more question. I'll put my health scrutiny check on. Thank you, David, for that, for those figures. That's the first time we've had them, because we've asked that question at our scrutiny commission a couple of times, and I think if we get more detail health scrutiny, because obviously with our background, mental health, and also to follow on, you can also, part of our reporting back to our scrutiny commission, add the information about which partners you're working with, because I've asked that several times and I've never been given the response. So I'd like to know which other partners you're working with in that sharp approach, because I do have some expertise on this.
Yeah, just on the, I've only been to one of the scrutiny, and I think the commissioning process, it's quite tricky really to mention the partners until it's gone through the cabinet cycle. So, you know, in terms of the Older People's Hub, that will be coming through, and also we can make an announcement now, which I was going to do at Council Assembly, on who will be running the new facility for children with mental health. So that will all be out in the open, but usually there is a bit of a lag around the commissioning cycle.
Okay, thanks for that. We're running over 15 minutes behind time. I suggest we take a quick comfort break and people get a cup of tea or coffee. Apologies for those people who arrived on time for their session, but we're human beings. We need a little bit of a break in order to carry on. So thanks again for coming along. Thank you. Okay, Councillor Lisa's still AWOL, but anyway, she'll be back at some point. So we move on to the next section, which is with Councillor Laurie. I've said to other cabinet members if you could speak for up to 5 minutes. You don't have to.
I'm happy just to take questions, I'm not sure what otherwise what I'm going to do, well,
I can give you an overview of all of the things that are here, but I'm pretty sure you've probably got questions on them all anyway, so if you want to save time, I'm happy just to go straight to questions.
Whatever you wish. Okay, so we'll go straight to questions then. But nobody's got any. Yeah, perhaps you just give a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, of course. So there's not very much in here compared to previous years. So it's probably worth starting with income. So it's worth saying that my portfolio covers 3 departments. The majority of the things that we want to talk about today sit within environment and leisure. There are no savings associated with my portfolio within housing modernisation. The bit of place and wellbeing that is covered is around a previous budget commitment that was made in 2018-19, which is being realised this year, which is around our contracts for specialist advice services, but that was previously agreed in last year's budget. So in terms of things for this year, so in terms of looking at income first, it's worth looking at the series of things that we are looking to do to generate income within the department. So we now have 2 rental incomes for 2021, both for Central Venture Play site, which has been rented out, and for Southwark Park Cafe, which people will have seen opened earlier this year. There's obviously also an increase in our fees and charges, which we do within every year.
The main new piece of income is around looking at our leisure centre car parking charges, and that's tied into broader conversations that we're having with the Everyone Active contract. But we think that it's right that we should be looking to secure income through car parking charges in both of the 3 locations, so at Peckham, in Camberwell, and in Surrey Docks Water Sports Centre. In terms of our efficiencies, there is one, and it's around capitalisation of staff costs on our construction projects. We don't think that this will have a material impact on any of the projects that are going on, but I'm happy to talk in more detail about that if you want to. And then in terms of our savings, there are 2 significant savings in here. One is around reorganising our parks client team, which will have an impact on the service that we provide, or that GM provide as our contractor to our parks, but we don't think that will have a significant impact, and alongside that we will do further adjustments to the contract in terms of the types of planting that we will be doing going forward, which also ties into our increased focus on biodiversity across the borough. There are then obviously a number of commitments within our portfolio, so these focus on our extension of our free swim and gym offer, so both making free swim and gym more flexible and making swimming lessons free for all residents, and then our second commitment around free theatre visits for all primary school children, which we are looking to roll out in more detail from April this year. And then the final one is around our tree service, which I'm sure members will know has been an ongoing increase in costs for us, having identified a significant number of more trees that we have across the borough, and this further £500,000 should help us to tackle that backlog and look at the future protection of trees across the borough.
As well as planting new ones.
Well, this one.
No.
That's in a separate.
I know. Okay, thank you for that. I've got a couple of members that have indicated. I just wanted to raise with you first. You mentioned about the free swim and gym. I just wondered what's the latest analysis of how that's working in terms of the take-up, etc.
So in terms of free swim and gym generally, we have been looking, and we continue to always look at the contract with Everyone Active and the ways in which that's working. We are currently undertaking a piece of work to look at how effective free swim and gym has been and how much we are reaching the target audiences that the policy initially went out to look at. And that's then tied into how we're looking at our free swimming lessons and who that should be rolled out to, and also how we can look to make free swim and gym more flexible. So one of the things we want to do is really make sure that we're hitting those target groups that we want to be targeting, and not those people who can afford to pay but are now seeing this as their opportunity to not have to pay to use our leisure centres going forward.
That's very socialistic of you, thank you. So I've got Councillor Werner, first of all.
Thanks for that. So I just wanted to ask you about, you mentioned you're going to reorganise the park teams, what that will involve. How much do you think you'll save from changing planting, so for example from annuals to perennials per year, to move towards a more better biodiversity within the parks?
Thanks for your question, Leanne. So there are 2 savings that altogether come to £160,000. So we're looking at having the removal of 2 posts from our parks client team, which would save us £100,000. One of those posts is already vacant, so we'd be looking to have 1 further post removed over the coming year. And we think that the contractor that we have in place at the moment is delivering exceptionally well, and we don't think that it would have a huge material effect by us removing that second post within the contract currently. In terms of the adjustments to what's within the contract and the types of planting, so there's a saving there of £60,000 is how much we would be expecting to save across the whole of the contract, and a lot of that would be looking at reducing the mowing that we do on some of our parks and changing, as you say, the types of planting that we are doing, which will also help us to increase the biodiversity across the borough, having things like wildflower meadows spread more widely across the borough, and some of those flowers that will flower more than once, which helps us to make sure that we're making a saving across more than 1 year as well.
Thank you. I've got 4 councillors who have indicated so far. Councillor MacDonald is next.
Yes, I had 2 questions, one related to Ian's about the free swim and gym and the free theatre. I guess one thing is like how much funding is being put into communications of these of what's available, because I think we find often people just, you know, it reaches the ears of people who, to your point, probably would know about it anyway. So how are we making sure that we reach groups who might not otherwise know about it? And then my second one was just on the tree inspection costs. It's sort of like, what was it before, just in terms of the conversations we've had about, or is this a new, the 500,000 for tree maintenance is new? So previous years, there's not a number that's been spent on tree maintenance. I guess we've had a conversation before you arrived about how we can see historic costs to make comparisons, but that was just one question I had. But yeah, comms around the free swim and gym. So I'll do the comms first and then we can pick up trees afterwards. So we've been working very closely with the comms team. I couldn't put an amount of money because it's more people's time that's been spent on working on that communication. And we work very, very closely with everyone active as well to be promoting the services that we do. So around swimming lessons, there was a whole programme of communication rolled out with posters advertising it. And everyone active, I think, mailed out to various mailing lists and the core organisations and groups that we wanted to be involved as well. And we're just now in the process of rolling out, that was obviously the pilot phase, of now looking to roll out actual swimming lessons, and we'll be doing a lot of communication around that. In terms of theatre tickets, we haven't yet launched what's going to be called Raise the Curtain, which is our new theatre tickets scheme. That's launching in April 2020. We've appointed an organisation called Eastside to help us work on that. We've started doing some, or they've started doing some initial conversations with schools, and there have been 2 trips already as part of the initial pilot for children to go. So I went down and met the kids from St John's, I think, last week, who went down to the Bridge Theatre to see The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, which they were very excited about. And so what we're hoping is that we can roll that out, obviously, as quickly as possible across the whole of the borough. But they're going to be doing the direct outreach with all of the schools to make sure that we can have 100% take up from schools going forward. And those schools that we identify as needing more support will get that within the work that Eastside are doing as well.
Great. Thank you. Councillor Edwards, please.
Oh, yeah. Hang on.
Oh, trees.
Sorry. So on trees, this 500,000 is a new 500,000, but there have been different amounts of money over every single year that we have kind of got for our tree budget. I'm not sure if we've got one single figure for the total amount that we have spent on trees, though.
I can.
We can probably, yeah, go on.
Some figures.
So last year there was an uplift on the 1st of April, sorry, this financial year. So in 1920 there is just over 800,000 for tree works and 360,000 for the client team staffing, so over £1 million in total. But in total we will spend more than that due to the backlog clearance that we're doing, but that was the revenue budget. So this is an extra 500,000 on top of that. So that's obviously grown from the year before, so that's an extra 300,000 on the 1st of April.
What that obviously doesn't include is any then further commitments we make around our new tree management strategy that we've recently passed through Cabinet, which looks at the future of planting more trees. This is all much more about tree maintenance and securing the stock that we've got across the borough.
As long as they're not outside my house, I don't mind. Councillor Edwards.
Not in my front yard. It's just a quick question around the parking charges. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, just a quick question around the parking charges for the leisure centres. You put in there that there is going to be an equality impact assessment in order to. Now, does the increased revenue take into account that we obviously don't want to discourage people with disabilities who may need to use cars in order to visit leisure centres? Does that take that into account?
So the figure that we've got in here is our best estimate of what we think we can bring in. So we would not want to disadvantage any of the people who are coming there with disabilities or who need somewhere to park from parking. What we are aware is happening in a number of our leisure centre car parks is that it is members of staff who are disproportionately using those car parks, or it is individuals who live very close in the area who could work there, or people are coming and parking in our leisure centres and then going off and doing something else, because at the moment it is free parking. So it's not even people who are using the services. So those are the people that we want to be able to stop from using the car parks, and we will of course make sure that we have mitigations in place for those that do need to be able to park.
Thank you. Councillor Buck.
Thanks. Just a bit of a larger scale question, really. Something that Councillor Ali raised earlier was around income generation and whether we have put any time into thinking creatively or kind of in a larger way that we can raise different amounts of funds. And I was wondering, obviously we've seen some usage of parks for events to raise money in Southwark Park. Have we thought creatively about different ways that we can use parks for income generation that might bring in substantial amounts of money? I mean, for example, Love Box happens in Hackney Fields every year. Can we have one in Burgess Park, for example?
Thank you for your question, Jack. We have obviously had an outdoor events policy that we've recently revised within Southwark, and we're really keen that people can come and approach us about the events that they want to hold. You would have seen last year we had 2 large-scale events, so both Gala and Alice in Wonderland, which took place in our parks, and they were the first 2 large-scale events that we have had. We are actively going out and promoting the parks and the green spaces that we have in the borough for people to use, but it's also very much that they need to be able to come to us and have those conversations. I would love to be able to do more events in Burgess Park. The biggest problem that we have at the moment is the misconception that Burgess Park has no public transport that allows you to get to it. And we are doing everything we can to try and talk to anyone who comes to us and says you can't hold an event in Burgess Park, that says pretty much every single bus in the whole of South London goes via Burgess Park. So if you know anyone that would like to hold an event there, please do let us know, because we are really, really keen to show the potential of being able to hold events there. But I think it is also worth saying that one of the reasons that we revised the outdoor events policy that we had was because we had feedback from both large-scale and small-scale events that were held in our parks last year, that we need to be able to balance the amount of time that we're giving to private organisations to take space in our parks versus the amount of time that local people should be able to have access as well. And so for us it's a bit of a balancing act to be able to make sure that we are able to bring in the income we want, but also make sure that parks are readily available for all of our residents.
Sorry, Chair, I did have one other question as well, if I may. Sorry, I kind of snuck the one in without follow-up. So just as a slight aside and sticking on the issue of income generation, obviously we have our leisure contract where we let out our leisure centre space to everyone active. And take, for example, the Elephant Leisure Centre, that was predominantly built using funds from private development through regeneration. Have we thought any more about how ongoing and future regeneration programmes can create assets for us which can then lead to income generation? So, for example, on Ogden Road, and maybe this is a question for Johnson later on or anything like that, are there any plans baked in for those regeneration programmes with private money that will end up with the council owning assets that can then help us with revenue funds?
It might be one you want to talk to Johnson about later, but it's probably worth saying things like the new libraries that we are investing in and continuing to build have community spaces and other rooms within them. So if you look at East Street Library, we obviously built the business hub on the side of that, which was a way for us to bring in further income for people to be able to rent out those spaces. Obviously we've got both the new library on the Aylesbury estate and Woolworth Library as well, and both of those we've been looking at ways in which we can make sure that if there are spaces there, we can bring in some income by renting out those spaces as well.
Yeah. So covered off events, talked about new spaces. We've got quite a lot of existing assets and we are looking really carefully. I mean, the Southwark Park Cafe, Central Venture Play site being cases in point where we need to make sure those assets are used for the benefit of the community and to bring in income wherever possible. It was not last year but the year before where we let our cafe concession contract, and that was much more lucrative than it had previously been, and our ice cream concession contract. So we're always thinking about income, but I think our primary concern will be our existing assets and using those. But yes, wherever possible, new interesting opportunities for generation are on our minds.
And Chair, I mean, I suppose the most obvious example of this is Canada Water, and you know, our decisions, which will be forthcoming about how much we invest in Canada Water, could in 15 years' time generate the council perhaps £30 million a year of revenue. But those decisions are still to be made. But that would be the most obvious example of something that could generate multi-million pounds worth of revenue for the council.
All subject to public consultation. Thank you. Councillor Kerslake.
My question's been asked, thank you, Chair.
Great. Has anybody else any questions they'd like to ask? No?
We've already spoken about this a bit, Rebecca, but on tree management, just last year there was quite a sizable increase because we identified that we had a lot more trees than we thought we did. And there's quite a significant increase this year, so I just kind of wanted to check, do we feel like we've got a handle on the extent of the maintenance question/issue?
Yeah, and Rebecca, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but a lot of what we did last year was to be able to identify the trees across the borough and then be able to start to do the work to categorise how much maintenance they all needed. So we've now been able to provide a much more accurate idea of how much resource and time and money we need to be able to put in to make sure that our trees are safe. So we would hope that this £500,000 will allow us to do that, and then we can look to implement our tree management strategy and future planting going forward as well.
Great, fantastic, thank you for that. You can escape. Okay, we're going to move on to the next section, which is with Councillor Williams. So if Councillor Williams would like to come up. I just wanted to say before you begin, Kieran, that members have only been given a copy of the HRA as we speak. So I'd appreciate it if you could concentrate on the general fund to begin with, and then briefly, if you wanted to say something about the HRA. I've said to cabinet members if they could keep their comments to 5 minutes maximum. So I don't know if you want to have 5 minutes on each, but certainly if you could keep yourself to the 5 minutes, that would be appreciated. Do you want to do general fund first then, please? Thank you.
Thank you very much. So yes, my general fund area is relatively small because most of my responsibilities fit within the housing revenue account, but nonetheless it's £78 million in total. And this year we're looking at finding savings in there of £1 million, income of £750,000, and commitments of £1.5 million, just over. So I just wanted to run through those. Before going to the lines that are in here, it's worth importantly saying in here, the biggest area of expenditure in my responsibilities is around the support we provide to people to help them find a home and our homelessness services. That's been an area that's seen enormous budget pressure over recent years, as we've seen the homelessness crisis spiral and also government take a whole range of action, not least cutting the local housing allowance that's risen our costs. We're managing to keep that under control this year, and we've got in place big plans to bring that down as we move away from the expensive industry of nightly paid accommodation that has been created across London. So on that line, the success, I think, is just holding the costs where they are, accepting that we're really dealing with an enormous pressure of supporting people who are homeless in our borough. So if I just run through the changes in here. So I'll start with savings. On the savings, these are things that are, I think, relatively painless and straightforward for us to do. So on concessionary travel, there's a saving of just short of £800,000. That's just because national guidance around concessionary travel has changed, eligibility thresholds have changed, and therefore we predict the number of people who will be eligible to reduce accordingly. Not something in our gift, but a change that's happened. Positive news on Tooley Street, where we're saving some money by fitting energy efficient lighting in the building, and perhaps more importantly reducing carbon emissions as a result. On our agency usage, we're saving £200,000 there, and that is really about us. It's actually quite an internal accounting mechanism. Whenever we use agency staff, our HR team receive a proportion of money from departments to cover the cost of that. And as we've reduced the amount we're using, that saving has come into play. And then we've got a realignment of travellers' budgets. That's simply because we had a temporary site where we had, when we were decanting people, we've now refurbed this site and moved people back onto their sites. So I will go on to income. Yeah, I'm rattling through. So the big area of income, which is a real positive for us, is £750,000 that we're looking at additional income from renting out more space within this building. That would be to NHS colleagues, and we're in the final stages of agreeing that with them, bringing more of the South East London cluster of the NHS into our building. And we're able to do that simply by providing some slightly more intensive use of the rest of the building for our staff, slightly higher desk ratios, but actually putting a lot of support into them so they've got the equipment and facilities to work in a more productive way as well. That's something we've already piloted at our new offices at Castlemead and has gone really well there and provides us some significant income. And then the last two lines on here for me are around commitments. The smaller one is the extension of the Blue Badge scheme. So nationally the eligibility has changed. That means that people with hidden disabilities are now eligible to have a Blue Badge. So we are anticipating more people coming to us to process those of people with mental health conditions and other things. And so we've got an extra member of staff to support that extra flow of people coming through. And then the bigger one is a big investment in our IT. That's partly to support the different style of working that we're moving to, partly to move to a more robust data systems. I'm sure you'll have questions for me on this one. And partly to put more money into our shared service with Brent and Lewisham. So we've got the staffing support to provide the quality of IT service that the council needs. So it is a significant commitment, but we think it will really help us be a much more efficiently run council and address some of the underlying IT issues we've suffered for a while.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. You've really kept the time, so we appreciate that. We've got a couple of members who've already indicated that they want to ask questions. There's another one. And another one. So I'll just, if I may, I just wanted to just talk about temporary accommodation. How many years now has that been overspent, that particular budget?
Michael, I'll have to go back to you for the number of years we've been there.
I don't know the answer to that. Ever since I've been here, which is only 2 years, but colleagues,
it's about 4 or 5 years that it's been growing.
Okay.
And what are the predictions then for it then?
So at the moment we're looking to keep within the budget we've got from last year, so the same expenditure we had previously. Our aim is to bring it down, bring this expenditure down, and it's worth saying the big reason why the budget is overspent is the cost of housing people in temporary accommodation for many families, most in fact, ends up costing more than we are able to claim back in housing benefit to cover their costs. So the council has to step in and cover a proportion of the cost of their housing. The thing that would completely change it would be the government going back to having a local housing allowance that covered the true cost of housing. That could change it overnight. Recently they announced that they would increase it in line with inflation, but of course inflation doesn't help because we're already about £1,000 a household shy of what we need. Inflation will continue to be about £1,000 shy. But the big change we are making that will reduce the costs is moving away from nightly paid and to secure tenancy, not secure tenancies, tenancies for people. Which nightly paid is an industry that's cropped up across London where people are on a licence, the costs are higher, it's what councils across London end up having to use as one of the few types of temporary accommodation available. But we've got quite a robust programme with our landlords to move away to that, to have a lower cost of tenancy for our residents.
Okay, thank you for that. I've got 4 councillors so far. I've got Councillor Buck first.
Thanks. So I will make apologies at the start check because I have a few issues that I need to raise, if that's okay. So starting on with temporary accommodation first.
It depends what, we need to confine ourselves individually to particular times.
Yeah, I understand that, Chair. Yeah. So starting off with temporary accommodation, I read through in the report that one of the issues that's being cropped up is the predicted reduction in estate voids, particularly on the Aylesbury estate, which obviously I represent. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about that because it's certainly not my understanding of one of the ward councillors for the areas that there will be less properties available. I know one of the projects that you've been working on is a stock survey of existing properties there. It's not something that we've had back yet or that we've heard back from you. So I wanted to explore that specifically because personally as a ward councillor I think there's huge untapped reserves of potential properties there that could be available for use for temporary accommodation, which would hugely affect the budget constraints that we're facing. The second issue, and maybe I'll just keep it there to keep the chair happy, is around district heating network investment, and perhaps I don't know if you're going to talk about the housing review account separately, but one of the things that's becoming increasingly apparent, I think, to ward councillors across the borough is that we're facing a bit of a crisis with our district heating networks, and we may potentially have to look at long-term future investment in them, either for large-scale repairs or replacements of those systems. I would expect that predominantly to be funded through borrowing, but that borrowing will have an impact in terms of paying that back. Has any long-term efforts looked into that? I mean, some of the numbers that we've spoken about, Kieran, are in the hundreds of millions of pounds. Have we thought long-term about the impacts of that investment and how that could affect the HRA moving forward?
Well, Councillor Edwards might be able to answer that question because there's currently a review going on by the Housing Scrutiny Commission. Anyway, Kieran.
I was going to come back to the HRA, so I have to do that.
Yes, leave that till later.
I'll note that question, I'll come back then. On the first question on temporary accommodation, so you're right, there is for all members of the panel, the largest proportion of temporary accommodation used within the borough is estate voids, and by far the majority of that is on the Aylesbury. We are currently undertaking a stock condition survey, but it hasn't been completed, and Michael,
Nearly finished.
Nearly finished, at which point we'd be able to come back and say what the implications of that are for the estate. In terms of reducing usage in the short term, I think we're just mindful that there will be a need at some point, we hope soon, to decant some of those blocks fully in order to allow the regeneration to progress. We're in quite rigorous conversations with Notting Hill about making sure that we have a robust timescale for that happening, and we don't want to assume we can rely on something that we may be able to move ahead with in the short term. I hope that begins to answer your question, but I think that you'll know we've got a more detailed conversation set up for ward councillors, yourself, Lorraine and Paul, to go through the full plans for the Aylesbury in the near term.
Thank you.
Michael, I'm not sure if there's something you wanted to add on that specifically.
Just to say that at the moment, I think it feels prudent not to be putting a lot more families into accommodation that we know isn't at the standard that we really like. So there's more investment needed. Those are tricky decisions when we haven't got very much money about where we spend our money, and some of the investment needed to bring the blocks up to the standard in individual units is very significant, and it runs into tens of millions of pounds. So again, as Councillor Williams said, outside of this, in a more detailed briefing, we can go into that sort of detail.
Okay, I've got Councillor Werner next.
So I've got a different question. So as you know, we've declared a climate change emergency. I was wondering how much have you allocated to cut carbon within your portfolio, and do you have any interim targets to cut carbon? So we want to be net zero by 2030. In the next year, what is our plan to reduce carbon?
Obviously the main leadership on this is not in my portfolio, but yes, it's something we've been looking at across the whole of Cabinet. The changes we've been making to date have been particularly about the energy efficiency of our council buildings. I mentioned lighting here at Tooley Street, and that's where we've undertaken. I'd have to come back with the total capital costs for that. One thing's definitely worth saying on that, although there is a long-term revenue return for the council, that, as I said earlier, that's relatively small compared to the amount of capital investment, but nonetheless it does make us a small saving and also allows us to hit carbon reduction targets. In terms of our housing stock, perhaps I can come back to that, but the two main areas are around our heating supply, where we absolutely are looking in detail at how we can make a reduction in carbon emissions and make a transition to a fully zero carbon heating supply for those that we supply heat to. And then the other is obviously the energy efficiency of our buildings. Both of those things require huge investment to be able to do. You're talking hundreds of millions of pounds to really bring our whole housing stock up to standard, and we are looking systematically at all the options, but I don't have the answers for that now for you.
Now what Councillor Chamberlain next.
Can I just make a comment that I think it's not very satisfactory to be given a report. I appreciate it has been to Cabinet, but to be given it during a meeting doesn't really help members that maybe have the selection.
Yes, no, I totally agree. I mean, we did indicate early on that we wanted to consider the HRA while Kieran's here today. It's never been done before because obviously it's all part and parcel of the usual process through consultation with tenants and leaseholders. And as you say, it normally goes to the Cabinet as a report and it comes nowhere near scrutiny. It's just that this time I thought it might be opportune that we may just consider it. Obviously we can't change it as such, but we can certainly raise questions about it. As I said at the beginning, the head of scrutiny left the council's employment before Christmas. I was hoping that the arrangements would be in place for this to have been distributed earlier in the month. Unfortunately, I had a bereavement. My father passed away just before Christmas, so obviously I was busy with other things for a couple of weeks. And Everton's only just taken over. So I'm sorry that it's very late. It's exceptional circumstances. I'm not happy with it, but obviously we are where we are. But I don't think, unless we sort of say that Kieran comes back later in the day to talk about the HRA, I don't think there would be another opportunity for us to consider this before it goes to Cabinet next.
It's been to Cabinet.
The Council Assembly then.
The Council Assembly. I mean, the HRA is shared between. It doesn't go to Council Assembly, so it's done effectively because it's been out to consultation. And the HRA is kind of shared responsibility between myself and Kieran. I will be here, for the rest of the day, so I'm happy to do my best to respond to questions if this is, if you don't feel you can do it now. If Kieran's happy with it.
I did, I mean, just, procedure is everything. I did request that this report be here in between the consultation, the final stages of consultation. Originally, I know everything has been changed because the Council Assembly and dates were changed.
I don't think the February's been changed, Chair. So we would, the challenge that we have is that the January Cabinet meeting, which took place last week, is when we agree the final HRA, but also when we publish the final version of the General Fund budget before it goes to Council Assembly. So you need to have this meeting after that Cabinet meeting. So I think if you want to look at the HRA in detail, the opportunity to do that is between the kind of the late December Cabinet meeting and the January Cabinet meeting. I think it's a good thing to look at, but I think you wouldn't do it at this meeting. You need to do it earlier in January.
Yeah, and this meeting was originally scheduled for early in January.
But then you couldn't have done the General Fund budget.
No, I know that, so it's got to be one or the other. But anyway, that we are where we are. So, so I can only apologise. So I'm in your hands if you want to leave this till later, when we can ask Councillor Mills.
It'd be good to have a chance to digest some of it at least.
Yes.
So maybe we do that over lunch and if there's anything we can pick it up later.
Yep.
I appreciate that we're going to digest also for
I appreciate that we're digesting this meeting for a day or so before we come back on Wednesday for the recommendations, but could we not just have that little section at the start on Wednesday? Or is because I appreciate we can't really impact, you're saying this is a done deal already.
It is. I mean, Cabinet papers are sent to us members. So this, the HRA budget, the draft budget, on which I think this is almost identical, the final budget, has been in the public domain for some time. I'm very happy to try to come back on Wednesday if that's more satisfactory. Obviously, the loss of Shelley before Christmas has caused some issues with papers being circulated. But I think HRA budget, if you want to look at it, you do need to look at it at a separate time to the general fund. If now it's having to be next year now.
Okay. Well, we'll note that for future reference. Kieran, can you come on Wednesday? Is that possible?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I think that's probably the best policy. Have people agreed that we defer the HRA for consideration until Wednesday? We'll take that at the start of the meeting. Okay. Thank you for raising that.
I did actually have a question.
It was just a comment.
Hi Kieran, I was wanting to ask about the additional income that's proposed to be got from letting office space at Tudor Street. So what study has been done of the capacity that actually currently exists at Tudor Street, and is there additional capacity that we could be looking at? And then you also mentioned that the way that we're able to achieve this is through sort of more intensive use of space and changing work patterns. So I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more on what that actually involves for staff members and how we can ensure that doesn't result in a loss of service to sort of residents.
Yes, certainly, and I'll get Michael to come into some of the detail. So we've looked very systematically at the whole building to look at what we can do to get the most out of it. And the aim is to have a plan that increases the desk ratio slightly, but also includes using some of the space that's currently used for paper storage and lockers and others to free up some of that space for use in the building. And to think about how our staff can work more flexibly within the building. We run a pilot of the new densities and new styles of working at the office that we opened at Castlemead, which is for our adult social care services, where they've been working at the new desk ratios with the new equipment, the new layouts of offices that include both tables that you can use your laptop at with a screen, as well as breakout spaces, more of them. And it's been really successful. I've been around the office and spoken to the staff, and they've had very positive feedback on their working environment there, and the ratios and working in that way. So we're confident we can do that in this building. We expect it to be a big change to move people around in the building, so it will happen over a phased period over the course of the coming year of moving people team by team, floor by floor, as they move around into the new arrangements. That would then free up some more space, bringing Michael in at this moment, to allow us to have external partners in. One thing we're very clear about the building is for those staff, once you're in, it's an open access building, so we'd only want people in the building who share our public sector ethos and culture and kind of appreciation of privacy and all the other things. So the NHS is an ideal partner for us. They're already in the building, and it would be more of their staff when they share those things. The only other bit to say that's not included in these plans at the moment, you'll be aware that the cafe here closed just before Christmas, as the providers decided it wasn't making money for them, and they gave us quite late notice that they were going to move out. But good news in that they found jobs for all those people who were working in the cafe before they left. I went down and spoke to a number of them as the team. It was very positive to hear that from them. But that does leave us a question of what we do with that space that we're now looking through and haven't worked through yet. We've got some good ideas. We'll have to think what the best use of that is. Michael, anything you want to add?
Thank you, Councillor. So just to say that we've undertaken numerous studies looking at existing use of space, so how many desks are actually being used at any one time, so that's covered all different times of the day, different days of the week, and we've identified that there's significant spare space. So at the moment we're operating a very generous person to desk ratio. We already know that the capacity is there, and we've seen that. We're not working though to a sort of one number fits all teams ratio, so we've looked at different teams. So some teams are pretty much just sitting at their desks and working at their desks all day. Other teams are going out and working other places. So we've got a flexible ratio depending on what the team is and what the services that's being provided. So we are completely confident that we have more than enough, and there is more than enough space to fit in the extra capacity that the CCG want. We're already working to those new ratios and in those new ways in some teams in Tudor Street. So it won't be a new thing for Tudor Street either. So Councillor is absolutely correct that we've got a whole new building working in this way, but that's also happening here at the moment. And of course we are looking closely at other options, including the space on the ground floor, to make best use of that.
Very quick follow-up. So what I'm inferring from that is that potentially there is even more capacity available in Tudor Street for an appropriate partner, like you said, Kieran, that would be suitable.
Quite possibly, yes. We'll have to look at what's reasonable and feasible, and obviously we don't want to make any assumptions about what that would generate, but yes, possibly in the future.
All bids gratefully received. Councillor Edwards.
Thanks, Chair. Just a question on the agency staff saving, which is very welcome that we're making that saving. What proportion of the overall spend on agency staff is the 200k saving? if you haven't got that here, it'd be interesting to know what that figure is. So it's quite a detailed question. The second bit is in the papers, there's talk about the kind of workforce planning that's allowing that 200k to be saved. Could you give us a little bit more detail about what has been done in order for us to reduce our agency staff?
So I definitely have to come back to you with the detail of the number. But in terms of what we're doing more broadly, so our commitment has always been to keep agency staffing as low as possible, accepting that there will always be some areas where you need, for short periods of time, extra cover. Really, that is down to the absolute detail of our HR team working with individual services that have had higher levels of agency staff to talk to them about, well, why is that the case? Is it because you're struggling to recruit? Is it because you genuinely have fluctuations in short-term to demand? And where we can see that actually there's probably a better way to do it, doing the detailed work with those teams to work through how we bring it down. It goes up and down over time and has been fairly flat recently. So we're trying to have another push now to see how much further we can go down in bringing the usage down. I mean, the other side of that that's really important, though, is the general push on making us a borough that recruits people well. So all the work we've done on apprenticeships is fundamental to us not having agency staff so we can recruit good people. All the stuff on us having a good reputation as a council, which we do across London, is really important for us to be able to recruit, particularly in areas like social work where there's huge competition for staff.
But I mean, it does vary from service to service. So actually, if you think about our street cleaners, actually we found that the best model is recruiting through agency and then moving people on to permanent Southwark contracts. And we found in that particular area that actually that route has been a more effective and cost-effective way, and actually the staff end up on permanent contracts, well paid, well supported, and so I don't think we will ever get to one solution for every service area.
No, I mean, you need to keep a flexibility within the organisation because it's horses for courses, and some things are only funded for particular years rather than ongoing, etc. Thanks. Councillor Kerslake.
Thank you, Chair. One quick comment and question. First of all, I'm so pleased to see the commitment on eligibility for blue badges being extended to people with mental health. So one of my constituents led a kind of one-man charge on this, Trevor Quick, so I'm really pleased to see his campaigning has paid off. My question is on, I just wondered if you, with your modernisation hat, if you wanted to talk a bit about the council's IT strategy, and there's a £1.5 million commitment in there for, I mean, it sounds very sort of sexy, but the shared information, communication and technology service, but that's a lot of money, and so how is that actually going to kind of make the council more efficient and ultimately save money?
It certainly is a significant commitment. It's worth saying, so in terms of IT, we have two broad arms to what we're doing. So there are those things that we are doing jointly with Brent and Lewisham to provide the core infrastructure for our IT, and then there are those things that we do internally within the council that are about making sure things work here and delivering individual projects, etc. The investment that you're looking at here goes into three broad areas. One of them is £500,000 more into the shared IT service. One thing that when we've done the detailed analysis with Lewisham and with Brent, is that to deliver the quality of service we want, now all three local authorities are in there, and it's just under-resourced in some key particular areas. So that's everything from the resourcing needed to answer standard calls when they come in, when people are logging their issues, through to some of the detailed specialisms that they need in the back end, from whatever that be dealing with servers to all the other aspects of the service. So this would be us putting in more in, Lewisham putting in more in, and Brent putting more in proportion to the number of staff we have, really important to say. And we'll just bring it up to a fully staffed, resourced service. There's been a huge detailed piece of work to look at making sure we've got that right, making sure that we're not just paying over the odds for the service, but that it is a normal amount of money to be paying for the quality of service we'd expect, and being confident that that is a good price and a fair price to pay, and to bring it up standard. The two other areas that this is putting extra resource into, so one of them is a shift, a short-term shift, in fact, to cloud computing. So over the next year, we're going to move from servers that we, in partnership with others, own, through to cloud computing for most of our uses. We'll still have some particular applications that have to run on servers that we have. Now, we've had a long history of trying to get our servers right in the council, and people who remember the days of Capita, would remember things being really pretty painful to use in the past. They've got a lot better, but they're still not as robust as they need to be. Increasingly, all local authorities are moving across to a cloud-based service. In the short term, there's more expense for us because we're going to have to run cloud services and our existing services in parallel with each other. So we have resilience while that changeover happens, but there will be a future saving when we turn off our servers. And then we've also got a increase. Importantly in there, the shift to cloud computing will also include costs that we were previously paying but that were capital, now having to pay through revenue because it's not service we own, it's a cloud service. So some of it's an accountancy matter rather than actual extra additional costs. And then the final area is related to cloud serving, cloud computing, moving across to online Microsoft 365 for your Word, Outlook applications, etc., and also the telephone use, which will be connected to that as well. There's an increased cost providing some of that, but actually provides us with a service that we think will be much more resilient. You'll have all the expectations of 365-day availability that you would get with using those big international providers.
Councillor Babudu, please.
Thank you, Chair. We've spoken a bit about temporary accommodation and the pressures there. I wanted to ask if you feel we're getting in front enough of trying to tackle and reduce homelessness. I think we talk about additional funding in the area at present of 0.716 million, and just kind of one query and a bit about what that's to do, and if there's more that you think we might be doing, given the kind of down the line we're incurring so much cost from homelessness.
So first thing to say, we're not changing the budget this time around here, so there isn't an increase. But the pressure has been there with us for a number of years, and what we're doing to address it is a really important question. So we have worked to completely change our services around so that they're focused on preventing homelessness, not just supporting people when they become homeless. We've led the way in the country on that, so we've got the highest rate of homelessness prevention in London. So that's people who come to the council saying that they are at risk of becoming homeless. It's the action we do to prevent them becoming homeless before that happens to the event. You go back just a few years, local authorities across the country, and indeed most still do. I'm intrigued what this noise is.
For whom the bell tolls, Kim. We'll sing along in a minute.
You go back just a couple of years for us in Southwark, and actually the majority of the local authorities still in the country. If you're at risk of homelessness, you'd come in and say, my landlord's evicting me, and the councils would have said, actually, we'll come back to us on the day that you're being evicted, and we will help you then. That's absolutely not our approach in Southwark anymore. We did do this to some degree before, but we absolutely now will say to people, this is the steps we can take with you now to either help you work with your landlord so you don't actually have to move out, whether that be a housing association or a private landlord, to help you perhaps with arrears that you've got, knowing that in fact actually if you can pay a relatively small amount of arrears, get a payment plan, whatever it might be, you can sustain your current tenancy, or if you really have to move, to find another tenancy before you become homeless. So that's the whole focus of our housing options service now. It's still an enormous pressure. It's 4,000 people a year coming through the service, looking for support with that because they are at risk of homelessness. So that's huge numbers that they have to work with and support. But that's our focus. And obviously that goes alongside investment in building new council homes, the work we've done recently on getting empty properties to be re-let to people in our borough, and the whole other range of options to help everyone in our borough have a home.
Do you think people are aware of the StreetLink organisation that they can get in touch with?
I hope people increasingly are, but just worth saying, so this is just a rough sleeping, which is a tiny fraction of homelessness, but obviously a really important fraction of it. So StreetLink is the national service. If you look up StreetLink, you can report anyone who is sleeping rough on the street. In Southwark, that means that the St Mungo's team that we as a council fund will go to them where they are on the street and offer them support. If someone's new on the street, they'll be able to get them off the street then and there. Some people who've been on the street for a long time have really complex things happening in their lives. That's not always possible. And increasingly what we're finding is the few people that are left on our streets in Southwark at the moment are people who've got no recourse to public funds. And actually we need change around that nationally to be able to get them all the support they need.
Are there any more questions? Yes, Councillor Ali. If people could check all their devices, this is driving me around the bend, by the way.
Just going back to the I don't really need it. Just going back to the IT piece. So you talked about obviously the movement of capital to revenue. Are government making any allowances? Because across the board, people are moving to cloud-based services, and so we're going to see an increase in the hit on the revenue budget. Is one question, and then if I may sneak in a second. So we've spent quite a bit of money on consultancy to try and get the shape of IT back into some sort of law and order. Are you confident that we now have, because you did talk about we've still got to do some hiring, but are you confident we have the right skills to make the changes that we have? And the reason I ask that question is because I appreciate the Capita legacy, but with some of the people that we've had, it's been very best endeavours, and so the quality of our IT is still not great.
On the capital to revenue, no, I don't think government is doing anything on this. We've had lots of internal conversations, finance colleagues, about is there some way we can continue to fund some of those server costs as capital, and the conclusion after lots of back and forth is we just can't, and the rules don't allow us to. In terms of the skills needed to deliver, so I'm absolutely confident that the new operating model for the shared service, and indeed for our internal service, is the right one, and that we'll staff up, and there's a lot of detailed work that's gone into doing that. Obviously we'll keep it under evaluation as it goes in. The biggest challenge though we face is just recruitment. In London, you can earn huge amounts of money working on IT in the city, and that means that local government that doesn't pay the same kind of money as the city ends up really challenging the recruitment. The big part of the answer to that for us has to be, as I said earlier, going back to internships, apprenticeships, and the whole process of growing your own staff and getting people in, of being clear about actually it's about a recruitment into a public sector ethos and the benefits that come with that. But it will continue to be challenging to get the specialists that we need in, when of course they can go across the river and earn a lot more money. But that's going to be the pressure going forwards.
So are you closed to considering further either consultancy support, or because some of the heavy lifting that has to be done is quite complex?
Look, our aim is to get people in-house and in our shared service and staff that up. I mean, that actually has to be the priority, whether it's our council-based team or the shared service-based team, to staff them and get to where they need to be. We have used some interim support, that's the word I'm looking for, interim support over the last interim support over the last period to develop what the new operating model has been, and actually that's been, I think, very successful, and we've had some people who've worked, done a good job of doing that. But we've now appointed jointly with the two of the boroughs a new permanent director for the service, and I'm pretty confident that they're going to come in and do a good job, and that we've got the right plans in place.
Thank you. Councillor Buck.
Yep. So just one note that if it's okay with the chair, I would like to hear an answer to the question on the district heating, if that's okay.
Actually, no, we're going to deal with that on Wednesday because it falls under the HRA. We've already agreed that, so it's not going to be considered today. We'll get a fuller response on Wednesday because you're prepared for it now. And I'd rather than just Kira, I know Kira will deal with it now, but we've agreed we'll take the HRA on Wednesday. Okay.
Okay, well, I do have another question then, if that's acceptable, Chair. Yeah. So specifically around rough sleeping and the issues that are being raised, and I know, Kieran, it's something that we've spoken about before, rough sleepers being a contingent of rough sleepers that are difficult for us to deal with at the moment, being no recourse to public funds residents. Given that I would expect the council to pass into its official policy tomorrow at Council Assembly a motion calling Southwark a borough of sanctuary, is it something that the council has considered making housing provision available for all residents with no recourse to public funds, and not simply those we would have a statutory duty through vulnerable adults or children? That may obviously have understandable cost implications, but if we are going to become a council that welcomes all refugees and migrants, can we consider that to be, if we're allowing residents to sleep rough?
So we would be absolutely delighted to look at anything that we can do and consider it properly. The challenge that we face is that there are legal restrictions on what resources we can give to people with no recourse to public funds. So there are some clear exceptions for people who've got specified high levels of need. In practice, that ends up being families with children where we can offer them support, and the legislation allows that. There are a whole set of other people, particularly single vulnerable people, who we simply don't we're not able to do the same things for. That said, if there are ideas around how we can provide some of that support, I'd be more than happy to sit down with anyone who's got those and think through what else we may be able to do.
I'm just going to add that the government has temporarily suspended, and they do that, I think, until the end of March, our inability to offer support to people with no recourse to public funds. So that helps people through the winter. But a council house is a public fund.
I'm sure suggestions will be forthcoming during the debate. Thanks again for that, and we'll see you again on Wednesday evening. Thank you. Okay, if we can swiftly move on to Councillor C2, please. Welcome. Just to let you know, I've informed each cabinet member that they've got up to 5 minutes to make a presentation, if they so wish, and I'd appreciate it if you could keep. I'll give you a reminder, don't worry, but I'd appreciate it if you could keep to that 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. In respect of the budget in both planning and regeneration, to give you an overview, if it will be helpful. So this particular part of place and wellbeing looks at both regeneration and planning, and between both the parts of the department, it's pretty much split evenly between planning and regen and transport policy, and it amounts to about £7.5 million in terms of budget. I would like to provide some context though, because our ambitions in terms of growth and development primarily is focused around delivering more homes, more affordable homes to respond to the housing crisis, which is really, really important, and that's our primary focus. But because of our ambitious growth, it's also important to recognise the other output of that, which is the increased council tax space over the years. And we've just been looking at figures, and because of our growth plans over recent years, we're seeing an additional £23 million in respect of council tax base. And it's important to highlight that because that contributes directly to frontline services, and we've seen significant cuts in recent years, 63p in every pound. I'm sure you've heard that before, but that goes some way in trying to mitigate against those significant cuts. So here in planning and regen, in respect of our approach to the budget, over many years we've sought to, not to beat around the bush, squeeze developers and squeeze people that can afford to pay in respect of planning fee incomes. And over recent years we've seen, I'll run through figures, 17-18 we saw a increase in income of £200,000, 18-19 £100,000, and again this year we're proposing an income of £120,000. Now this is as a result of the scale of ambition and being absolutely clear on what our policies are, but also getting through applications and making sure decisions are made on applications and setting the planning framework policy in a concise manner. This has also led to a commitment for planning and regen, and the figure you'll see is £300,000, and I'll talk to it very briefly. When I speak to colleagues right across London, they say they typically have one master plan area. They typically have, in terms of ambition, in terms of new council homes, typically it's in the mid-hundreds as opposed to thousands. In Southwark, our scale of ambition is significantly higher. So we're seeing multiple master plan areas, and we're seeing ambitions in respect of 2,500 new council homes by the end of 2022. And why is that important? Is because you all know we are responding to a housing crisis. Now, to be able to respond to that, we need to have a planning department that is able to get through those decisions in a speedy manner. We've also recently declared a climate emergency, which is going to have significant impacts in respect of our planning policies as well. We need to be able to have the right planning team to be able to respond to that, ensuring that as a borough we're thought leaders and we are leaders in respect of actions as well. So the £300,000 will go towards both supporting our new council homes delivery, responding to the necessary changes we'll need in terms of responding to a climate emergency, and also ensuring that we continue to make decisions and go through planning applications in a timely and concise manner. Over recent years, we have achieved planning fee income budget setting, so we are confident that we'll be able to achieve it again this year. That's it in a nutshell.
Excellent, well done. Thank you very much. Okay, so can we throw it open to questions? I've got Councillor Ali, please.
So in your, sorry, I'm really rubbish with this microphone. It's either on or it's off at the wrong time. So as part of your budget submission, you talked about growing your regeneration team specifically around the Old Kent Road, but there isn't much detail underneath that. So would you be able to just outline a bit more detail around how many additional FTEs? Are they going to be operating with the wider team, or are they going to be their own team? And what's the highest salary expected within that group?
In respect of, thank you. To give some context behind the Old Kent Road Area Action Plan, because I'm conscious that colleagues may not know about it. So it's an ambitious master plan for the Old Kent Road. Ambitious target in terms of 7,000 new affordable homes, 5,000 new social homes, new transport infrastructure in terms of the Bakerloo Line extension, new public spaces, new green and open spaces. And to be able to ensure that we're responding to the community. So at the end of 2018, we held a series of Old Kent Road forums. And as part of those Old Kent Road forums, there was a number of suggestions, both in respect of changes to the master plan, and also setting up new forums like a community review panel. We've committed to delivering and setting all of those up. So the money will go to us being able to fulfill those commitments, which will mean there's more accountability to the local community. It means that our policies are more responsive to the local community and still ensures that we're able to deliver against those targets. In respect of that direct question, in terms of how many FTEs, the simple response to that, it hasn't been quite pinned down in terms of what that would look like in terms of number of FTEs, but the line in the budget gives you a flavour of what those areas will be, what the money will go towards, and not just Old Kent Road team, it will go also to new council homes team in terms of the planning element of it, and also responding to climate emergency as well. So in respect of number of FTEs, that and Simon, please do come in if I'm missing anything. That hasn't been quite pinned down, but it will be pinned down in terms of the fullness of time, in terms of allocating resources.
£300,000 represents, can be approximately 6 full-time equivalents. Councillor Sutu is correct in saying that we are currently reviewing exactly what we need, because we're going over a number of vacancies that exist in the division already, looking where the capacity is needed, and that capacity will be built up by increasing probably the number of the entry-level people who we have coming in as graduate planners, grade 8 in our grading system, about 24 to £26,000, I think that is. Somebody can check the the grade numbers for me. And we also need some more experienced people who supervise those people at our grade 12, going up to about £48,000 in a salary. And we need to maintain our ability to turn around planning applications. We've kept above the old government target for many years of 80% of planning applications being dealt within the target period. We have got that up to 90% and over 90% at times. It's a service that we want to maintain. We're not at 90% at the moment. We've got to push back up there. We're also conscious that we need to actually improve the service to members. The planning committee itself has an awful lot of work to do, requires a lot of support in briefings, information, clear reports, preparation for meetings, etc. That's an area that we're looking at. And as Councillor Sutu said as well, climate change, putting a great deal of pressure on the council to be very clear and precise in all of its advice and decision making, what exactly is going to get us to net zero carbon by 2030, what planning decisions, what planning policy, and what scrutiny of developers' proposals is going to be needed for that is something that we're working through at the moment.
Okay, I've got 5 councillors who want to raise questions. The first is Councillor Mack.
Thanks. So I had kind of 2 questions which relate to the income generation lines. So in terms of the planning fee incomes, when you said that the figures were 200k, 100k, 100, was that your forecasted amount versus what you actually got in, and how confident are you that the 120k for this year will come through? And then it was just a question around the project management fees of 1% on the construction sums. Is that like how's the 1% calculated? Is that a fixed fee that you just always impose, or is there flexibility around that?
You want me to respond straight away? Sure. Or should I take round through? So in respect of the figures I quoted earlier, so those are the budgeted figures that were set in previous years, and we did hit those targets. So we are confident that we'll be able to hit the line that we put in the budget for this year. In respect to the 1% construction fee, you know, in any new capital project, there's an element of advice that the planning and regen team offer. It's just stipulating what that figure is and accounting for it in the budget, basically. But I'm not sure if there's anything else.
I would just say confidence in forecasting income is, yes, we can be confident that we can see growth in income. We've seen a trajectory over several years. What we can't be absolutely certain of is that the property market and the development industry will stay as active as it has been and will continue to make the planning applications that provide the fees.
There hangs another tale, no doubt. Councillor Buck.
Thanks. 2 questions. Firstly, on the addressing climate change issue, obviously we've committed £2 million towards the first bulk of a fund, but through planning applications from private developers, there's obviously a carbon offset fund for schemes that don't meet carbon neutral. So what do we do with that money, and how are we using it to address kind of the strategic task of meeting net carbon as a council in the future? And secondly, on the regeneration at the Elephant and Castle, we've obviously got a relocation fund for traders that's going on at the moment, and that's a part of development agreed by the council and Delancey. Within that relocation fund for traders, there's still quite a few that haven't been found premises, and there's been concerns raised about the relocation fund that's been agreed with Delancey in the Section 106. Does Johnson think that there's potential extra costs that could accrue from the council there in topping up that relocation fund if it's not deemed adequate for traders? And has a full and up-to-date equalities assessment been done of the trader relocation settlement that was agreed in the Section 106?
So I will take on the carbon offsetting fund. So that particularly relates to Section 106, so it won't necessarily be captured in this general fund revenue account. But I'll touch on it very briefly. So our approach is to set the highest of standards, and we've recognised this in the New Southwark plan in terms of carbon reduction, and we're going further than the London plan. And I think it's important to just state that. But secondly, when people and developers don't hit that target, there is a penalty in place, and this is the carbon offsetting fund. Now, we've said, because we want to be strategic, we'll link it to any outcomes of the climate strategy. However, we recognise there is a need that you can have some initial projects straight away. So one of the things that we have embarked on is we're looking at how we light up communal areas and estates and making them more sustainable, ensuring that estates are more safer, more well lit, and also bringing down carbon emissions in those estates. It's funny, we'll be talking about it very briefly at Council Assembly tomorrow as well. But yeah, no, it's an absolute focus and priority for us to ensure that we're spending it as soon as possible, so the estate lighting, but also tying it in with the outcomes of the climate summit. In respect of the trader support for Elephant and Castle, I think it's to give context, because I appreciate not everybody will be aware of the current situation. So there was a planning agreement and a planning application agreed, and it set a figure in respect of the relocation fund. It set that figure at £634,000, and it was, when it was agreed, and I know people have views on the particular application, but it was agreed that it will go towards supporting traders. I think it's important to recognise what the council's done, and we've always been committed to supporting traders in the shape of pushing the Landsea to have a dedicated trader support in the shopping centre through Tree Shepherd, and every single trader is able to go up to Tree Shepherd on a daily basis. They open 3 days a week to be able to get advice and support in terms of relocation space. The council also has a relocation database which works with the local businesses in the area to talk about and open up the local space as well. The council's also offered a street market in a wider area, but I'm not going to talk too much about that. In terms of the relocation fund, the Landsea have said publicly on 2 separate occasions that the £634,000 is not a cap, and they expect to go above that. We will be holding them to that, and it's really important to hold them to that. So I don't expect that figure to remain at £634,000 from the Landsea. However, there is a question for the council and to reflect as to what we're doing to support the traders. And as we look towards the closing of the centre, of the shopping centre, we are constantly reviewing what offer and support we're providing for traders. So all I can say at the moment is we will do everything we can within our power to support traders, whether it be offering relocation support, offering wider support through Trade Shepherd, and it's not something that we are taking lightly. And if there is anything that we can offer in terms of further support, we will be doing so.
Chair, can I just come in and quickly say the £2 million money that we set aside for the climate emergency is lifted from the regeneration reserve. So our hope, we're forward funding this, but my hope is that Johnson and Simon will be working to replenish that reserve through growth and regeneration and developers, but effectively that is where we lifted the money out for the climate emergency.
Okay, thank you. Can I move on to Councillor Salmon, please? Call you whatever I like.
There we go. Something, because Simon's here, I'm taking a little veer off here. Main planning meets so often. They work really, really hard, and absolutely no problem. I sit on planning A, also meets regularly. Planning B has only met twice this year, and that's a very expensive SRA for this last year, whatever, so far this year. Have only met twice. Now, I'm going to suggest something controversial. You don't need planning B unless you can foresee that they're going to be doing having a decent amount of meetings. But you could give an attendance allowance to those on the main planning who are often asked to meet at very difficult times because of the Old Kent Road, because of all of these. I'm just going to put it out there as a suggestion. I think planning A is absolutely fine. Planning B, I'm just worried that they don't appear to be meeting, and there is an SRA for the chair there, and I'm just thinking main planning have had how many extra meetings this year alone because of the Old Kent Road mostly. So it's controversial, I know, and I know they're different budgets and everything, but that's what I'm going to put out there.
Well, I thank you for that, and can I say again, various options have been considered and probably will be considered as a means of best way going forward. And I'm sure, I don't want to take words out of Johnson's mouth, but I'm sure he's actively looking at different scenarios.
Yeah, and we are actively looking at, particularly the point that you highlight in respect of the Oakham Road and the scale of ambition on the Oakham Road, and how do we ensure where we are making decisions in a timely manner, but recognising the pressure that's put on committee members who do a fantastic job in a often difficult environment. One thing I will say, I think the SRAs it's a different budget, so I'm not going to comment on that. One thing I will say is in addition to the Oakham Road, we're constantly reviewing, and this indeed, in terms of the growth commitment, is looking at how we support the committee as well. And all applications, credit to the team on this, are spread as much as possible across the different committee. And the type of applications that will go to committee, subcommittees, are new council homes, things that have been called in, and things that have smaller schemes as well. I'm sure you know this, and it's fair to say you have particular peaks in your particular trusts, but having a holistic review is something that's on our radar.
Thank you. Councillor Werner.
Thank you. And thanks for coming to our Environment Scrutiny panel last week. I found it really useful, so thanks for that. So the government proposals changes to the regulations, which are likely to have an impact on energy efficiency. What will the impact of the removal of the fabric energy efficiency standard have and on reducing carbon in the borough?
That's a very, very good question. And I'm going to Simon, if Simon, I know, I'm going to have to come back. I'm going to have to come back to you. But one thing I will take away, and I think it's important to highlight.
Regulations from the government and how it will impact on us.
Yeah, and I think it's a fair point, because one thing, Councillor Wyler, that I particularly found helpful and interesting in terms of that scrutiny meeting was it challenged both planning and regeneration to go away and look at, well, what are we doing, and are we doing it fast enough? And do we have the potential to be leaders in this field? And actually, it's a fair challenge to put to us. We have a significant ambition in respect of planning and regeneration, and so we should be equally ambitious in respect of responding to the climate emergency as well. But I will come back to that.
Well, we look forward to a good answer to the good question.
Yes.
Thank you. Councillor Chamberlain, please.
Hi, Johnson and Simon. I just wanted to ask whether or not you felt there was any capacity to ask private, particularly larger developers in the borough, to contribute more towards planning and regeneration. Conversations I've had with those larger developers, ones that are providing hundreds of homes in the borough, have suggested that they would be willing to pay more for a dedicated planning officer, whether or not that's through, actually paying for someone's salary directly, or paying more for accelerated planning fees. It feels that there is more we could be getting from our bigger developers that are delivering the private homes in the borough than we are currently. And actually, we should, £300,000 is not a lot of money to pay for 6 officers for some of these larger developers. Why are we taking the burden as a local authority? Why are we not asking those private developers that it's in their commercial interest and to actually to take that burden for us?
It's a fair question, Councillor Chamberlain. To give you some context, so when I took on this position, a couple of years ago, it's fair to say over the last couple of years, we have increased planning fees, and actually we're now in a position, I know we're not specifically talking about fees, but we're now in a position where we're in the upper quartile in London in respect of planning fees being charged to developers, and particularly the bigger developers as well. And it's important to also highlight that with really big strategic schemes, there is an agreement in place as to what we expect and in terms of what the fee would be as well. So, I know Simon will say this as well, there is already a degree of significant charges in respect of the big strategic developers, in terms of planning fees as well. But there's always more, and I'm happy to take away that point. I think you always have to find a balance though, because if a developer is paying for a specific officer, there lies in an ethical question in respect of who is that officer accountable to, and how close is that relationship. So there's a number of questions to take away. But you know, in respect of higher fees, we have increased over the last couple of years. We do need to find a balance in respect of not dissuading and not, you know, not creating a situation where developers don't play with the rules because you've set the rules in a way that they can't essentially. But we do need to be firm as well, and that's what we've done over the last couple of years.
And so, Chair, I think it's income line 216 reflects increased income from British Land, for example, in line with the development agreement. So rather than necessarily key staff being named in the development agreement with some of those bigger developers, this is already, you know, happening in a similar way to what you're presenting now.
I'm sure developers would like to throw lots of money at us, but I'm sure equally your party would be the first to criticise us for taking it. But anyway.
No, not at this stage, really.
Yeah, I'll believe it when I see it.
It's the balance. It's the balance.
Okay, Councillor Lisa, please.
My question refers to page 35, B44, when it talks about efficiency savings of 83,000 for new recommissioning agreements on arrangements on information advice services. I'm assuming what I think that is, but can you just clarify what the information advice services contract is? And then I might have a supplementary question.
Yeah. I think it's communities.
Is it information advice and guidance?
Yeah, so that will be Councillor Rebecca Uri.
Okay.
But it's a fair point. I'm sure we can come back. Yeah, no, but happy to come back.
We can email the relevant officers.
Yeah. Happy to take that one.
Okay, great. Good. Are there any more questions? No? Excellent. Thank you very much. And now we'll take a well-deserved lunch break ahead of schedule. 5 minutes, not bad. Well. I might extend it actually. What time should we say? Should we come back?
2:15. 2:15.
Chair, I think the challenge is whether Councillor Cotto and her officers are available any earlier than their schedule.
Yeah,
oh, I'm sure they will be. They're being given fair notice. No. We'll reconvene at 2:15. Thank you.